Insightful podcasts by informative hosts. Insights into Things, a podcast network. Welcome to Insights into Tomorrow, where we take a deeper look into how the issues of today will impact the world of tomorrow. From politics and world news to media and technology, we discuss how today's headlines are becoming tomorrow's reality.
Welcome to Insights into Tomorrow, episode 21, Is the Supreme Court Broken? I'm your host, Joseph Whalen, and my co-host, Sam Whalen.
Hey everybody, how's it going?
How you doing today, Sam?
Doing okay, excited. We're getting back into the flow. This is like our third episode in a couple months?
Something like that, yeah.
Back on a roll.
Yeah, well, at least now when we do plugs on our other shows, I don't have Madison saying, well, you're not quite monthly podcast. That you guys don't do monthly anymore. So at least now we're getting back into the flow of things. So today we're going to be talking about whether or not the Supreme Court is broken, with a series of landmark rulings from the Supreme Court, some of which were precedent-breaking, almost all in support of the current conservative agenda. Is the Supreme Court broken? Are 9 unelected justices, 3 of which were handpicked by probably the most controversial president in American history, dictating the direction of a government that is supposed to be a republic of the people? Well, that's what we're going to be discussing today on this episode of Insights into Tomorrow. But before we do that, I would like to take a moment to invite our listening and viewing audience to subscribe to the podcast. You can find audio versions of this podcast listed as Insights into Tomorrow. You can find video versions and audio versions of all the network's podcasts listed as Insights into Things. And we're available on Pandora, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Spotify, any place you can get a podcast these days.
Rest in peace, Stitcher. They're shutting down.
Are they? I hadn't heard that. Oh, I got to take those off the list then.
Yeah.
Wow, they've been around a long time, too.
I used to use Stitcher, and then they changed their interface, and it was terrible, and then I stopped using Stitcher, and I think a lot of other people did, too.
Apparently a lot of other people did, too. You can also email us or reach out to us. Our email is comments@insightsintothings.com. We are on Twitter at insights_things, or you can get links to all those and more on our official website at www.insightsintothings.com. Are we ready?
Let's get into it.
Here we go. So our first topic comes from New York Times, and they tell us that the recent Supreme Court term concluded with a series of 6-3 decisions divided along partisan lines, with the court's 6 Republican appointees in the majority. Those rulings on affirmative action, student loans, and gay rights were reminiscent of the transformative conservative decisions issued last June on abortion, guns, religion, and climate change. Is the Supreme Court in crisis? And if so, how could it be fixed? Complaints by the Supreme Court have cropped up throughout American history, but they've taken on renewed urgency since President Biden's inauguration. In the past, some of these criticisms have come from the left, such as when Franklin Roosevelt threatened to, quote, pack the courts to protect New Deal legislation. Others emerged from the right, like anger aimed at the, quote, activist bench that decided Roe v. Wade in 1973. But more recently, Democrats, stung by the Republican Senate majority's refusal to hold hearings on President Barack Obama's nominee Merrick Garland in 2016 and its replacement of Ruth Bader Ginsburg with Amy Coney Barrett just weeks before the 2020 presidential election, have reinvigorated calls for reform.
So is there a problem? Is there a problem with the nation's highest court? The appointment process has become more politicized than ever, like most things in this country, leading to dogmatic justices and a court whose legitimacy among the public could be in danger. In the past, it had not been the case that the public could look at these 9 people and see them projecting the ideological preferences of the political party that brought them to the bench. After Brown versus Board of Education, a case could be made that something changed in the American psyche. The idea that the court had, quote, final interpretive authority had been solidified in the public mind, and the, quote, perceived power of the Supreme Court in popular political culture vastly expanded. This shifted the debate to how to interpret the Constitution, which created an even bigger incentive for presidents to vet and select judicial candidates who would faithfully execute their agenda. So because of that, leaders began to choose nominees who were young enough to influence decision-making for decades after that president had left office. So you're seeing, they'll appoint a judge, but even after they've left the office, we're still seeing the ramifications of that appointment years after the fact. One effect we have today are judicial amendments to the Constitution, which with no ready means to overturn them. Of course, short of Congress actually cooperating to add new amendments to the Constitution that the justices would have to consider, of course. So, we're looking at what all this means, right? These judges have a ton of power, and, with this 6-3 Republican majority, how is that affecting a lot of these decisions?
Yeah, and without going into a civics lesson here, the purpose of a 3-part government with an executive, a judicial, and a legislative branch was to have separation of power. Mm-hmm. And at no point in time when that form of government was created was the intent to have Congress actually writing laws. So the problem that we run into now is that because Congress can literally interpret what the Constitution says, they can tell you now what those laws are. So even if a law says one thing, the Supreme Court can come in and rule against how it's actually written. And I'll give you an example. One of the things that you hear a lot about in the news is your Second Amendment right to bear arms. Well, one of the things that a lot of people who talk about this subject fail to mention is that in the Constitution, it says the right to bear arms is tied directly to militia. Mm-hmm. And the Supreme Court simply interpreted that as to not be the case anymore. And they decided that everyone should be able to bear arms, whether you're with a militia. Now, if you look at the history of militias, local militias, which everyone remembers, the Minutemen and all that stuff that were the militia, they were evolved through legislative processes into what is today the modern National Guard. So when we say militia today, that equivalent is National Guard. Now, you can make a case that says only the National Guard, who are citizen soldiers, should have the right to bear arms, and it would make sense. But the court didn't interpret it that way, and the court says everyone should have the ability to bear arms.
Right.
We're seeing this now, and one of the things that we're seeing now is that the decisions that are being made along partisan lines. And the entire concept of the Supreme Court is that they're supposed to be impartial. They're appointed. They're not elected. Mm-hmm. And they could be appointed by either party, of which parties themselves technically are unconstitutional, since there's no concept of political parties in the Constitution that you can make an argument for right there. But the problem that we're running into now is you've got people that are on the court that are not necessarily making impartial decisions from what people are saying. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been kind of tough to watch, honestly. Especially when you think about how you would like things to work we're not necessarily a straight up democracy. We're a republic, or a democratic republic, right?
Federal republic.
Yeah. But in a certain extent, you would want the will of the people to be reflected by the people that are leading us. And I don't really think that's the case necessarily, especially when we are going to look at a lot of these rulings today. A lot of people don't agree with these rulings, but there really is nothing we can do about it because they're the Supreme Court and they hold all the power when it comes to these things. And especially when you've got the conservative majority, obviously a conservative agenda is going to be more pushed, than the other side of things. And there's just no getting around that.
Well, and the one point the article makes is that the only thing that Congress can do to take back the power that the people elected into them would be to come up with amendments to the Constitution. So the Supreme Court would then have to consider these amendments. Of course, they could rule any way they wanted on those amendments. But the problem you run into now is that the political environment is so contested, there's no way you're going to get both Republicans and Democrats to agree enough to get any kind of amendment passed. And to be honest with you, with the politicians we have today, I think the last thing this country needs is people starting to write amendments to the Constitution.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope.
So how do we get that power back into the hands of the people?
Oh, you're asking me? I have no idea. I mean, I legitimately have no idea because, like we talked about, these folks aren't elected; they're appointed. So I guess it would be voting for the political candidates that you think would appoint the judges you want. But even then, there's no guarantee that's going to happen. I don't know if there's a legal way to to like contest it. I don't think there is, right? It's the Supreme Court. I mean, you always go to that higher power. The highest power for law is the Supreme Court, right? So maybe at the state level.
Theoretically, the only thing that really could be done would be what the Republicans were concerned the Biden administration was going to do, and that is pack the courts. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing constitutionally that says the court is limited to 9 justices. We've had more in the past. So the president could call for the expansion of the Supreme Court, add, say, 3 additional people to the Supreme Court, appoint 3 Democrats, so you'd have
6 and 6.
6 and 6 at that point in time, and try to bring some balance back to it. That's feasible, and that's something that's well within his power, but the punishment of the attacks that he would get for packing the court like that from the Republicans, he'll be impeached within a week once he even mentions that.
But wouldn't you want it to be balanced? Is that not, like, wouldn't you want enough?
I would, as a citizen, I would.
But I guess if you want...
As a Republican,
right.
You don't when you have the power.
Yeah.
Because, if you look at history, whenever government power has been balanced, where the executive is one party and the legislature is another party,
nothing gets done.
Nothing gets done.
Yeah.
And really, that's really the best scenario that we have at this point in time is gridlock. Because if neither side can get anything done, they can't screw things up any more than they already have.
Yep. Or further assert their own agenda and get more power for themselves.
That's it. And the problem that you have right now is that when you can appoint members to the Supreme Court that will carry out your agenda and not be impartial, that is packing the court, really.
Right.
And they did exactly that under Trump, where they rushed through the last appointment after Ginsburg died.
Yep.
And had she held out, and I don't mean to make light of this, but had she held out, because I think she was in a state of coma at the time, and they had just kept her on life support, they couldn't have filled that seat until after the election. And you would have had a more balanced, it still would have been imbalanced, but you would have had a more balanced court at that time. So yeah. I think the problem we have is the process by which justices are appointed is now ripe with corruption, and it has become a political process. And I think that the integrity of the Supreme Court has deteriorated to the point that you've got Supreme Court justices now that are under investigation for corruption themselves, where you've got Clarence Thomas, who's under investigation for taking undeclared presents or undeclared gifts, basically bribes,
right,
from a very prominent, very well-known Republican supporter that he was supposed to declare and didn't. And when you've got that kind of suspicion on your Supreme Court, it's really hard to take them seriously as being a Supreme Court at that point.
Yeah, because ideally, at the end of the day, we all know politicians are corrupt, right? I mean, everybody knows that. But ideally, you would want the last line of defense to be the Supreme Court, to be impartial, to be the one thing you can count on to kind of right the ship, but that is not the case anymore. And maybe it hasn't been for a while.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think that's the problem we're at. That's the situation we're in now, where they were always the sanity check. They were always the ones that came in impartially. Not always. I mean, there was partiality in there for years, but they were the element of government that would come in that were the babysitters that would, push the two sides apart and say, all right, let's look at this. Let's look at what's legally precedent. Let's look at what's best for the country, and let's do the right thing. And you're just not getting that referee from them now.
Yep.
So I think we're going to take our first break, and when we come back, we're going to take a look at some of the more impactful decisions from the most recent term of the court. We'll be right back. For over 7 years, the Second Sith Empire has been the premier community guild in the online game Star Wars: The Old Republic. With hundreds of friendly and helpful active members, a weekly schedule of nightly events, annual guild meet and greets, and an active community both on the web and on Discord. The Second Sith Empire is more than your typical gaming group. We're family. Join us on the Starforge server for nightly events such as operations, flashpoints, world boss hunts, Star Wars trivia, guild lottery, and much more. Visit us on the web today at www.thesecondsithempire.com.
Welcome back, everyone, to Insights into Tomorrow. Today we are discussing the Supreme Court and some of their recent decisions. So the first thing we're going to cover is the ruling on affirmative action. The Supreme Court effectively gutted affirmative action, ending race-conscious admissions. In a historic decision, the U.S. Supreme Court recently, like we just said, ended race-conscious admission programs in colleges and universities across the country. In a decision divided along ideological lines, the 6 conservative justices, supermajority, that's a cool word, maybe not in practice, but it's a cool word, invalidated admission programs at Harvard and the University of North Carolina. The decision reverses decades of precedent upheld over the years by narrow Supreme Court majorities that included Republican-appointed justices. It also ends the ability of colleges and universities, public and private, to do what most say they still need to do, and that's consider race as one of the many factors in deciding which of the qualified applicants is to be admitted. So that's the first thing we're covering. This is a pretty big deal, especially for those that are affected by it. And it was really that public and private thing that I really latched onto, that it's everywhere. You think of the big schools, like it mentions Harvard and North Carolina, but this is going to affect a lot more than just them.
Yeah, and there's, with all things, there's two sides to every story here. And really what we're looking at here is you've got one side that basically says that you can't, by bringing race in and giving preferential treatment to one race over another is discrimination. So you can't do that. When the point of doing that was because discrimination existed already.
Right.
And you were getting preferential treatment to one race over another. So they legislatively forced you to, if not change that practice, then to at least adhere to certain percentages, certain quotas that you had to have. And the problem that you run into here is that you're saying, okay, let's do it away with discrimination administratively. Well, then, in a perfect world, that works. You can do that. But we don't live in a perfect world, because when you do away with administrative discrimination, you still have endemic
Societal
yeah. discrimination that's going to take over in that place.
And that's kind of the thing, that when people argue that, they argue the first point that you said of, oh, well, it's discriminatory to have affirmative action. But then people forget that, racism exists. And,
Right.
that's why it had to be, forced in the first place, is because if we make it laissez-faire, it doesn't work. It's not equal, and it needs to be mandated to make it well, I guess it's not equal, but you know what I mean, to give those people the opportunity that they otherwise probably would not be afforded and now will not be afforded.
Well, and I think that was what the original point of this legislation was. It was to force you to make it even. But in trying to get to that point, you simply instituted a different form of discrimination. So you're treating the symptom, not the problem. The problem really is the discrimination. And until human beings can evolve to the point that they don't discriminate, you're not gonna have that happy balance. And that's kind of what the majority have argued. The 6-3 majority, conservative majority in the court, argued, quote, many universities have for too long concluded, wrongly, that the touchstone of an individual's identity is not challenges bested, skills built, or lessons learned, but the color of their skin. Our constitutional history does not tolerate that choice. Now, I take exception to that one to begin with there, because our Constitution declares that all men are created equal. And when it was written, they knew all men weren't created equal, because also in the Constitution, 3/5, every African American who was in the country was counted as 3/5 of a person. So the hypocrisy in the Constitution itself tells me that we don't have a constitutional history that says this is intolerant.
Yeah.
As he has done before, Justice Thomas, the second black justice appointed to the court, reiterated his long-held view that affirmative action imposes a stigma on minorities. Now, this I think he has a point with. I don't think the way he puts it here has a point. He says, quote, while I'm painfully aware of the social and economic ravages which have befallen my race and all who suffer discrimination, I hold our enduring hope that this country will live up to its principles that all men are created equal, all equal citizens, and all must be treated equally before the law. Now, I think he's smart enough to know that that's not how the world is right now.
No, that's
The fact that he makes a statement like this is naive, and it's insulting, really.
yeah, because it puts the
statement.
ball in our court of like, hey man, we got rid of it. You guys got to be better.
Right.
It's like, no, the Supreme Court exists to do that. It is your job, and more so part than like every citizen, to uphold these values and to fight for this kind of equality that you're talking about here. But you're not doing that. You're doing the opposite of that. And then
Right.
you're basically washing your hands of it and saying, well, hey, we live in a society. You know what I mean? Like,
Right. Now, to Thomas's point, I can understand the rationale that by holding African Americans to a lower standard, that you're imposing a stigma on them. And really, if it was me, I would be insulted. So really what we're talking about here is, if you have two people who are one white, one black, they both apply for school, you have to take, under normal circumstances, you would take the person who's the most qualified, and that qualification would be equally measured. But instead, what we're talking about here is somebody who may need a 3.5 grade point average if they were Caucasian to get in, an African American may only need a 3.25. And Thomas's point is, by holding them to that lower standard, you're basically telling them that they're not good enough. So there's a logic to it, but the way that he uses that logic is so distorted and so tone deaf to the spirit of this legislation, because what's happening is, in reality, you're saying, reality is saying, if the Caucasian has a 3.5 and the African American has a 3.5, we're going to let the Caucasian guy in because he's not black. And that's what reality is.
yeah.
And Thomas fails to address that with his stigma argument. So Chief Justice Roberts goes on, and for his part, pointed out the court's 2003 decision reaffirming the constitutionality of affirmative action programs, noting that Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, writing for the court at the time, had suggested that there would have to be an end at some point in the future. And Roberts declares that time is now. And I think the problem is, it hasn't. Human beings,
It's only gotten worse.
not even human beings, Americans have not gotten to the point that they're mature enough to assume, to understand that all men are created equal. With the amount of legislation that's happening today that is discriminatory, that is holding African Americans down, that's holding Asian Americans down, the hatred that is an upswelling of political force in this country today is a clear indicator that not only are we not ready, we're not moving in the right direction, we're sliding backwards from where we need to be.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be something we say a lot on this episode. It feels like we're regressing.
Yeah.
And I think it is absurd to assume that the time is now is when we need to end affirmative action. If anything, we might need to go the other way with it to make it more affirmative, right? Because things seem to be only getting worse, and that's going to be a common theme here. We also have the opposing view, and this is from Justice Sonia Sotomayor. She said that the court subverts the constitutional guarantee of equal protection by further entrenching racial inequality in education, the very foundation of our democratic government and pluralistic society. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, the court's first black female justice, also chimed in saying, with Let Them Eat Cake obliviousness today, the majority pulls the ripcord and announces colorblindness for all by legal fiat. Sorry. When you're quoting Supreme Court justices, they're much smarter than I am. But deeming race irrelevant in law does not make it so in life, which is exactly what we just talked about. Just because you say it's that idea of like a post-racial America, right? Like we elected Obama, racism's over. It's like, no, it's not.
Right.
And that is clearly being reflected here as well.
Yeah, no, and the problem that we run into here is that what the majority are arguing here is they're arguing the point of a fiction, that in a perfect world, we shouldn't need this legislation. And they're right. In a perfect world, we shouldn't. The world we live in is far from perfect.
Yeah.
And this happened to be a stopgap measure to make things better. Nothing else has happened in this world to make that situation better. Mm-hmm. If anything, that situation's gotten worse. So by taking away some of the safeties that you had in place to try to provide legal protections for people, you're doing your part. You're being part of the problem, not part of the solution at that point.
Yeah. Why did they do this? just to have a rule? What was the motivation behind it? I don't even like.
Well, the motivation is what motivates conservatives to want to do things like this.
Yeah, I guess just further the agenda, right?
Right. They're pushing an agenda which they shouldn't be pushing an agenda. They should be looking at each and every case on a standalone basis and making educated, objective decisions. They should not be influenced by party politics, and that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah, I wonder if we'd have as harsh criticism if it was the other side, right? But I also think the liberal agenda or Democratic agenda is not as aggressive as the conservative agenda, and not as
which by its definition doesn't make sense.
Right.
That your conservatives are the more aggressive.
And that you're supposed to not like big government, right?
Exactly.
And this is the opposite of that. This is the biggest government.
Well, you could argue that this is a limitation of government because it's government making impositions over the schools. And they're saying, well, government shouldn't do that anymore. The schools need to regulate themselves.
I more so meant the 6-3 majority basically being able to do whatever it wants without being stopped.
Yeah, no, I agree. But I think
I see what you mean, though.
The motivation that they have at this point in time is, we're a progressive Supreme Court now. We're going to do things right the way that we see it. We're going to make the changes that should have been made years ago, and they're going to undo what's being undone. And there's a couple of problems with that. One, you're undoing existing precedent. So by every time you undo a precedent, like they did in the last session when they overruled Roe versus Wade, every time you overrule a Supreme Court precedent, you delegitimize the Supreme Court.
Nope.
The whole point of the Supreme Court
It's the word. It's final.
is it's supreme.
Right.
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 So when the Supreme Court can override the Supreme Court, then what the Supreme Court today, who's overriding that, says can be overridden.
Who watches the Watchmen? You know.
Right. So they're delegitimizing the Supreme Court. So that's probably one of the biggest problems that you run into. The other problem is the things that haven't been ruled on, that really are important stuff that need to be ruled on, are being pushed to the side so that they can use this agenda that they have to rewrite the rules that have already been written. So you're hurting the country. You know, be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem.
And you know, you talk about the correcting itself. So the Supreme Court overriding itself. It's like it really does. I didn't even think about that until just now. It really does have a very harmful effect because that basically could eliminate precedent in general. Because
Absolutely.
if they rule on now and then in 10 years there's different judges and they just are like, no, that's not. We're just gonna get rid of that. It's like, well, then what was even the point of doing it in the first place? It's like it's all temporary until. You know, you have a majority the other way that comes in and just does everything the other way. It does really delegitimize the whole process.
And that's what we've seen with political parties as well. One political party will come in and they'll be in power for 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, whatever, you know, they control a legislative and executive, and they'll push their agenda. And the other side will fight them tooth and nail. Then they'll switch powers and the balance changes. And then the other guys are fighting. And nothing gets done. Nothing substantial gets done. We don't get universal health care. We don't get tax reform. We don't get any of the things that the country needs because they spend all the time fighting. Now, we expect that from our politicians. We don't expect that from our Supreme Court. We deserve better from our Supreme Court because these are appointed positions. They don't have to campaign. They don't have to get elected. They're not chosen by the people. They're handpicked, they're cherry-picked by the president, and it's for life. And they need to be held, they're not even held to the same standards, the same moral and ethical standards that lower courts are held to. There's no ethical board that oversees the Supreme Court. You would think instead of being the exception to the rule, the Supreme Court should be the precedent to the rule. They should be the ones that are under the most scrutiny. Their taxes should be looked at on a regular basis. Their gifts that they receive, their rulings that everything should be looked at. Their political affiliations, the friends that they take their vacation trips with, all of that stuff should be gone over with a fine-tooth comb on a constant basis because of the position they're in and the power that they possess.
Yeah.
It's dangerous that it's not. And it's dangerous that these people can possess more power than the elected officials in this country. That's really where the problem is. And it has a broader impact. You know, this recent decision is likely to cause ripples throughout the country. And not just in higher education, but in selective primary and secondary schools. Ultimately, effects will be felt in every aspect of the nation's economic, educational, and social life. From the Rooney Rule that requires a minority applicant to be considered in all NFL coaching hiring decisions, to employment and promotion decisions, the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in schools and workplaces, and much more. The Supreme Court literally just said discrimination is legal.
Yeah.
That's what this decision says. And that is exceedingly dangerous for this country.
And I really think it is naive too, because how are you able to exist, especially as a Supreme Court justice, where you've been dealing with law your entire life? Surely you'd be able to see that people are not treated equally, right? These things, you know, if you let things run themselves, they will not run well, right? Like, it's not going to just fix itself. It's not going to be equal if you let people do it, because like we talked about at the top of this break, affirmative action was put in the first place because it wasn't equal. So it's like, do you think that's just going to magically fix itself, especially now when, you know, hate crimes are on the rise and discrimination's worse than it has been in a very long time? And, you know, but then again, maybe that's all part of the plan.
Well, and I'll be the first one to say, you know, I watched the the hearings when Clarence Thomas was up for Supreme Court nominations, and the questions that he was asked and how racially biased the people that were questioning him from the other side were, and that was Democrats questioning him at the time. It was brutal. And that was a small fraction of what he's had to put up with his whole life. Because he's a man who has set precedent his entire life with his career being African American, doing the things he did. You would think going through that and then making the statements that he said on this ruling, they were coming from two completely different people.
Yeah, like how do you even believe that when he says that?
Right.
Like,
It's astonishing what he's saying now and what he's been through in his life.
yeah.
So
And that was point number 1.
Yeah.
We've got 2 more to do.
that was rough. We're going to take another quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about something that might be a little closer to you, and that is the student loan forgiveness plan being rejected. We'll be right back.
Insights into Entertainment, a podcast series taking a deeper look into entertainment and media. Our husband and wife team of pop culture fanatics are exploring all things from music and movies to television and fandom. We'll look at the interesting and obscure entertainment news of the week. We'll talk about theme park and pop culture news. We'll give you the latest and greatest on pop culture conventions. We'll give you a deep dive into Disney, Star Wars, and much more. Check out our video episodes at youtube.com/insightsintothings. Our audio episodes at podcast.insightsintoentertainment.com, or check us out on the web at insightsintothings.com.
Welcome back, everyone, to Insights into Tomorrow. We are continuing our discussion on the Supreme Court's recent rulings. So in this segment, we're going to talk about the rejection of the student loan forgiveness plan. The Supreme Court effectively killed President Joe Biden's $400 billion plan to cancel or reduce federal student loan debts for millions of Americans. The 6-3 decision, we've heard that number a lot, with conservative justices in the majority, said the Biden administration overstepped its authority with the plan, and it left borrowers on the hook for repayments that are expected to resume in the fall. The court held that the administration needed Congress's endorsement before undertaking so costly a program. The majority rejected arguments that a bipartisan 2003 law dealing with national emergencies, known as the HEROES Act, gave Biden the power he claimed.
The president said he would work toward a new path for student debt relief using the Higher Education Act, which he called, quote, the best path that remains to provide as many borrowers as possible with debt relief. He also moved to create a, quote, on-ramp that would help ease the risk of default for students who fail to make payments when the current pause ends. Biden blamed Republican officials. Again, it's always the other guy's fault. Biden blamed Republican officials for causing the dispute that led to Friday's ruling, saying, quote, they had no problem with billions in pandemic relief loans to businesses, and those loans were forgiven. But when it came to providing relief for millions of hardworking Americans, they did everything in their power to stop it.
That's actually a pretty good quote from Biden.
Yeah.
I feel like we don't get a lot of those.
I'm sure it was written and somebody else wrote it.
Loan repayments will resume in October. Can't wait for that. Although interest will begin accruing in September. The interest is where they get you, by the way. The Education Department has announced payments have been on hold since the start of the coronavirus pandemic more than 3 years ago. Oh my God, where does the time go? The forgiveness program would have canceled $10,000 in student loan debt for those making less than $125,000 or households with less than $250,000 in income. 26 million people had applied for relief, including me, and 43 million would have been eligible, maybe me, the administration said. The cost was estimated at $400 billion over 30 years. Yeah, this is a heartbreaker. Let's really hoping this will go through. Obviously, I'm biased. I have student loan debt. And this $10,000 would have been a decent chunk of my loans that would have really helped me out. Now, I understand. I hear the argument, right? People are saying, well, you have to work to pay off your loans. But if you go watch, and I don't remember what episode it was, the episode where we talked about student debt, we talk about how the cost of college has gone up astronomically. So it's not as simple as just saying, oh, you have to work harder, right? Like, and this usually comes from the older people, older generation of telling people my age, well, you just have to work hard. You have to, you need to stop buying your avocado toast so you can afford to buy a house one day, when it's really not that simple. Especially when interest, like I mentioned, the interest is where they're going to get you, because as the interest compounds and compounds on itself, I've heard so many stories of people that have been paying their loans for like 30 years and they still owe more than when they started because of the interest.
Yeah, and I think, again, this is another one of those situations where the proposed solution is treating the symptoms, not the problem. I totally agree that $10,000 off your loan would be really nice. But the problem isn't how much you borrowed. The problem is how student loans are structured. And in the episode that we had talked about student loan, the fact that it's predatory, number one, where these banks are coming after students knowing what the cost of college is and the potential for getting paid back over time, the banks are willing to wait for it, especially when they know they're going to take your debt and they're going to sell it to other companies and make money that way. And then these companies that sell it then get investors to invest in it. And the last thing these investors want you to do is pay your loan off. Yep. What they want you to do is keep paying your interest, because that's how they get their money. The problem isn't necessarily students that borrow money to go to college. Part of the problem definitely is the cost of college, which has gone up unjustifiably. The other problem is these aren't traditional loans. These are credit cards, basically. If you went out and you bought a house, say you bought a house, we'll just use round numbers. You bought a house for $100,000 and you get 10% interest, which is like credit card interest on a house, by the way. But we're just doing it to illustrate.
Economics are hard.
So at the end of 30 years, you would have paid $10,000 in interest on that house. So your house would have cost you $110,000. That's it. The amount of interest that you're going to pay on that house is calculated the day that you get your loan. And it's a fixed amount. They amortize it over the course of the loan. And for the first 15 years, the majority of what you pay is going towards interest on that house, so the bank gets their money back. The bank is guaranteed to get their money back. After 15 years, the majority of the money is principal on the loan until you pay the loan off. By the time you get to the last 5 years on the loan, you're paying almost nothing in interest because the interest has already been paid back. But it's a fixed amount. If they structured student loans the same way, rather than charging you compound interest like a credit card, this problem would go away tomorrow. You would take out a $100,000 loan from the bank for your student loans. You'd pay your 10%, and the most you'd ever pay is $10,000 on that loan under that situation. And the problem of never-ending payments doesn't come into play. The problem of paying $100,000 more than the $100,000 that you were charged for your education goes out the window. That's what they should be concentrating on. They shouldn't be concentrating on trying to give you $10,000 towards your loan. That's not going to solve the problem. Because the problem is you owe that money to somebody, so the government's going to give you forgiveness. Well, the government has to pay that somewhere. So where's the government? The government's not a for-profit organization, right? They don't sell, lemonade. They don't have a lemonade stand somewhere where they're making money. The money comes from the taxpayers.
Right.
So their entire income is us. So if you're not paying your loan, someone's paying it, and it's the rest of the American taxpayer. And that's why it's very difficult to convince somebody who doesn't have student debt to pay for somebody who has student debt. What they should be doing is they should be changing the way the student loans are structured. They should be capping the interest payments on there. They should be capping how opportunistic these loans are.
And how easy they are to get.
Yes. If you did that, you could solve this problem. Until then, you're shining a turd here trying to make something pretty out of it.
Now, I will put on my tinfoil hat here. you mentioned that this really isn't fixing anything. But for people like me that are important for a Democratic president that may be running for re-election soon, this would be a great reason to get a vote for him, right?
Well,
If you're
you are. And that's a good point. So he's buying your vote. That's
Right.
really what this is. The problem is that the demographic that you are, the number of participating voters in that demographic are disproportionately smaller than the number of senior citizen voters, the ones who are going to be on the hook for
Yep.
paying that back. So that logic is valid, but the practice itself doesn't work because the numbers don't work out.
Yeah.
Because if you could get more people your age to get out and vote, it would work. But we can't. You know, the voting percentage of people in your demographic is like 15% or something like that.
I guarantee it's going to be even lower.
Right, where the voting percentage of people 65 and older is like 70%. So that's not going to work out in your favor, even if he is trying to buy your vote.
Yeah, you're not buying enough of the vote.
Right.
He
Right.
should repay, he should make it like an elder care bill or something.
Right, but if you fix the problem and you fixed how student loans were financed, it would work for because it won't cost the government anything at that point. You simply write legislation that says how you have to conduct your loans, and you then enforce that legislation. And people who don't abide by that legislation, you impose a fine on them, and the government has another source of income without paying for loans.
So why do we think what's stopping them from doing this restructuring? It seems pretty simple.
It is, but the problem is you have to get both parties to agree to it. And they can't agree to the color of the sky at this point.
Yeah, especially even if they want to, because it's from the other side, they're not going to do it.
Exactly. Joe Biden could propose legislation that would solve world peace and guarantee food on the table for every human being on the planet, and the Republicans would oppose it because a Democrat proposed it.
And they'd call it woke too, probably.
Right. And it's not our responsibility to create world. And you'd get stupid arguments like that.
Yeah.
When it's like, why can't these idiots just do what's right for the country and what's right for the citizens? They can't, because if it makes the other guy look good, then in turn it makes them look bad.
Right. When in reality, it doesn't. It's we should all be in this together. We all live here.
Right.
But
I mean, you look at the parties now going into the primary, both parties are tearing at each other's throat, telling you why you shouldn't vote for the other guy of their own party.
which is contributing to voter apathy, which is why people don't want to vote.
Exactly.
Maybe we'll make this another episode, maybe, but I was always of the mind that you should always vote no matter what, and I'm really being convinced maybe not. I don't know who we're gonna have in the presidential election coming up, but it's gonna be tough for me to pick somebody, right? And I know we go with the old lesser two evil arguments, but they're both pretty bad, or they both probably will be pretty bad. And I don't know. Like I said, we can make another episode, but it's the first time in my life since I've been able to vote, this will be my 5th year, because I'm 23, I guess 24 by then, or 5. But yeah, it's really a struggle. It's difficult, and I understand that voting is important and that you should always vote. But on the other hand, it's I feel responsible for who I vote for.
And that's the thing. Most voters go out there. So there's a large chunk of voter that votes along party lines because their parents did, and they'll never change. And they're kind of locked in. There's a certain percentage of those. Then there's the kind of people who are easily swayed, the kind of people who hear one argument, don't do any research, and go do their thing. They're the uninformed voter. Then there's the informed voter. They're probably the smallest percentage out there. They're the ones the politicians are terrified of. Because if you're smart enough to go out and do your own research from multiple sources and draw your own conclusions, you terrify politicians. They want mindless lemmings out there that they can tell you who to vote for, and you'll just go do it. And if you vote along party lines, you're the ideal candidate. They don't have to say anything. They could go out there and kill people in the streets, and you'll still vote for them.
Yep.
That's what they hope for. And if you're informed, and the one thing that we try to do on all of our podcasts is to educate and inform people, enlighten people. Don't listen to what I'm telling you. Don't listen to what we say on the show. Go do your own research.
Yep.
If I'm wrong, come back and tell me that I'm wrong about something. I'm happy to hear that, and I'm willing to have my point of view changed if it's legitimate. But don't just vote. The politicians go out there, you have to vote. It's important. Go vote.
They guilt you into it.
Right. But, as a citizen, it's your job that's the one duty that you have is to vote. But what they're really saying is vote for me.
Right.
And voting is important because it's the only way that our kind of government continues to exist. So I totally advocate people vote. But when you're voting, if you're voting in your local election or your school board or something like that, understand the choice that you make affects you. You may not think who's in Congress affects you, but I'll guarantee you it does, because the amount of money you pay in taxes and the amount of money they take out of your pocket is something you can control by who you vote for. And if you vote somebody in this time and they don't do what you want, or you don't think that by the end of their term you're better off, or if you are worse off, vote the next guy in. And then vote the next guy in. Keep doing that until you teach them that you're in charge. The first thing the politician wants to do when they get into office is get reelected. That's their number one priority. It's not you. It's not their constituents. It's not the people that contribute to them. It's to get reelected. And they're never going to vote term limits on themselves. The highest office in the land has term limits. Politicians, Congress, Senate, they'll never do that. We have the power to do that. If you don't let incumbents get reelected, you're imposing term limits. And even if the guy gets in and you like him, vote him out. And vote the next guy out. And vote the next guy out. Don't let him get entrenched. Don't let him get in there. Don't let him create a power base or start to influence things or anything. That you've got people now, and I'm going off topic obviously here, but it's important to discuss. You had Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell gets up there the other day and does a presser, and something in his brain hits pause right in the middle of it. Now, I'm not saying this to be mean or facetious or anything. It was very clear the man had some kind of health issue at that moment. But they walked him off the stage and brought him back a little bit later after they did whatever they had to do to fix the wiring there so he could finish what he was saying, so he could pretend like he was still okay. And that was just so they could keep power. That's what they're doing. They did the same thing the same day Dianne Feinstein.
Was that where they told her to just say aye?
Just say aye.
Yeah.
Because she was completely oblivious as to what was going on because she was so far gone.
We see it with Biden all the time, too.
Yeah. And, you know, this isn't a crack on old people or mental illness or anything like that. But there comes a point when you're no longer effective at your job.
Right.
And when you get to that point, I used to unload tractor trailers for a living. And when I hurt my back, I couldn't do that anymore. So I knew I had to change careers. I had to go do something else that was not impactful to that. And I did. Had I kept doing it, I wouldn't be able to do my job and I'd get fired. You can't allow people to stay in power who can't do the job.
And unloading tractor trailers is much lower stakes than running the country.
That's true. That is true.
And that's the part that scares me is like you have these people that may not, and it's okay, you know, when people get to a certain age, you might not be all there.
Absolutely.
But that you shouldn't also still have the same amount of power as you did when you were fully lucid.
Right. You know, they talk about Reagan when he was in office, where he started having onsets of Alzheimer's. And do you really want someone who's suffering from a disease like that to have his finger on the nuclear button?
Yep.
Like, you have to do what is right. You have to have some moral sense of right and wrong to put your foot down in these times, or at least have the gumption and the class to step away and say, look, I can't do this anymore. I'm not up to it anymore. I can't do it the way that it needs to be done. Let a younger person come in and do this type of stuff. We as the voter have the power to do that.
The more you know.
Anyway, that's it for my soapbox for there. We're going to run over time here, but that's okay. We're going to come back with our last segment here and talk about religion, free speech, and gay rights. That should be a quick one. We'll be right back.
Insights into Teens, a podcast series exploring the issues and challenges of today's youth. Talking to real teens about real teen problems. Explore issues from braces to puberty, social anxiety to financial responsibility. Each week, we talk about the topics concerning today's youth. We look at how the issues affect teens, how to cope with these issues, and how parents, friends, and loved ones can help teens handle these challenges. Check out our video episodes on youtube.com/insightsintothings. Catch our audio versions on podcast.insightsintoteens.com or on the web at insightsintothings.com.
Welcome back, everyone, to Insights into Tomorrow. We are still covering the Supreme Court's recent decisions after a brief aside.
Sidebar into politics.
Yeah, but we're back, and this is our last point for today. Religion, free speech, and gay rights. That's a lot, but we're going to do our best. The 6-3 decision, which turned on the court's interpretation of the First Amendment, appeared to suggest that the rights of LGBTQ people are on more vulnerable legal footing, particularly when they're at odds with claims of religious freedom. The ruling was the court's latest in favor of religious people and groups, notably conservative Christians. The Supreme Court sided on Friday with a web designer, recently. The Supreme Court sided recently with a web designer in Colorado who said she had a First Amendment right to refuse to design wedding websites for same-sex couples despite a state law that forbids discrimination against gay people.
Justice Neil Gorsuch, is that Gorsuch?
I have no idea.
I'm not very good
Neil.
with names. Neil. Justice Neil.
I'm sure he loves to be called that.
Writing for the majority in a 6-3 vote, said the First Amendment protected the designer, Lorie Smith, from being compelled to express views she opposed. Quote, 100 years ago, Miss Smith might have furnished her services using pen and paper. Those services are no less protected speech today because they're conveyed with a voice that resonates further than it could from any soapbox.
Yeah, I was reading the show notes before the show. What? I don't understand what that means. Like, what is he saying?
Basically, he's saying that because it's something that's being done on the internet and has a wider reach, it's no different than if it was a printed material.
Okay, gotcha.
The case, though framed as a clash between free speech and gay rights, was the latest in a series of decisions in favor of religious people and groups, notably conservative Christians. At the same time, the ruling limited the ability of governments to enforce anti-discrimination laws. The justices split, surprisingly, along ideological lines, and the two sides appeared to talk past each other, kind of like politicians tend to do. The majority saw the decision as a victory that safeguarded the First Amendment right of artists to express themselves. The liberal justices viewed it as something else entirely, a dispute that threatened societal protections for gay rights and rolled back some recent progress. This also comes at a time when transgender people are facing increased discrimination at the local and national level, with the American Civil Liberties Union stating that there are currently 492 bills in the works around the country that would directly harm transgender individuals.
And this goes back to what we're talking about with this backsliding that we're feeling, right? This is another example of that. Using the Constitution as the weapon. In an impassioned dissent, Justice Sonia Sotomayor warned that the outcome signaled a return to a time when people of color and other minority groups faced open discrimination. It was the second time this week that the justice summarized her dissent from the bench, a rare move that signals deep disagreement. Appearing dismayed, Justice Sotomayor spoke for more than 20 minutes. Quote, "This case cannot be understood outside of the context in which it arises. In that context, the outcome is even more distressing. The LGBT rights movement has made historic strides, and I am proud of the role this court recently played in that history. Today, however, we are taking steps backwards." A Colorado law forbids discrimination against gay people by businesses open to the public, as well as statements announcing such discrimination. Ms. Smith, the woman who owned the website, who has said that her Christian faith requires her to turn away same-sex couples seeking website design services. I'm sure that's probably in the Bible. Jesus probably has a Squarespace page. Seeking website design services has not yet begun her wedding business, nor has she posted a proposed statement on her current website about her policy and beliefs for fear, she has said, of running afoul of the law. So she sued to challenge it, saying it violated her rights to free speech and the free exercise of religion.
So you jumped on my point too quickly there. So, okay, first of all, there's nothing in the Bible that is anti-gay, anti-LGBTQ, nothing like that. There are no teachings,
There's not? I thought there was.
nothing.
I'm not even joking. I legitimately thought there was about like
Not
men.
a single mention.
Oh.
There are stories about same sex. There are instances of it occurring in there. Nothing is ever preached against. In fact, if you go by the teachings of Jesus, Jesus says to love all men, to love all people. So there's nothing in there. How the court could even use that as an excuse, number one. Number two, I'll guarantee you there's nothing about websites in the Bible, okay? Maybe the new King Charles Bible there might be, but there's nothing in the King James Bible or before it that has anything to do with it. So that's a falsehood.
And that makes sense why Justice Neal had that quote that he had, because you have to frame it so it's legitimate.
Right.
And not a bunch of baloney.
So, and the other problem that I have here is she's not being forced to express opinions that are contrary to her beliefs. She's being contracted to produce a website for someone else. If she didn't like fur coats and she made a website for someone selling fur coats, nobody would confuse her as being the person selling fur coats. Mm-hmm. So using that as logic for why you can't produce something for someone else is bogus. So there isn't a single argument in this case that has a leg to stand on.
It worked.
But somehow the conservative Supreme Court decided to latch onto this with as flimsy an argument as it was to set precedent again.
And to legalize discrimination.
And that's exactly what it is. That is how dangerous this Supreme Court is, and that is how broken this Supreme Court is that they took something that was so flimsy, it shouldn't have gotten past.
It's like a Judge Judy case.
Right. It shouldn't have gotten past TV court.
Yeah.
Okay. It was literally that weak of an argument. And somehow the Supreme Court decided that was important enough to listen to.
And to create such like strong precedent.
Right.
Which makes you wonder that they could do it with anything, right? Like
the Supreme Court receives hundreds and hundreds of cases a year to hear. And they go through and they cherry pick the ones that they feel are the most important, the most impactful, and the ones that are the most influential on the Constitution. And they pick this steaming pile of crap as one of the ones that they wanted to talk about.
It's pretty tough to not argue there's an agenda when this is what they go with.
Exactly. That's why it was vitally important that we talk about this one.
Yeah.
I'm embarrassed at our Supreme Court for even listening to arguments on this case. It's that bad.
Right. And it's like, if you actually look at the case, it is just gay people trying to exist. And when you look at a lot of these anti-LGBT laws or anti-trans laws, it is just people trying to live and maybe get married. And it's like, it's always framed as if they have this like agenda, like they want to take over the country, the LGBT people.
Indoctrination.
Yeah.
You got to throw that in there
It's
too.
a bunch of baloney, man. Like it's these people are just trying to live and be treated fair and equally, but that's just not allowed.
No, and the worst part is the state itself had already passed legislation that prevented this.
Right. So move.
Now, the problem that I have, I have several problems with this. The other problem that I have here is this Constitution says any laws that the Constitution does not explicitly cover fall to states' rights.
Yep.
There's no anti-discrimination law in the Constitution. So therefore, if the state has a law that governs it, the state should take precedent. The Supreme Court should have had no jurisdiction over this case whatsoever because of that law that was on the books.
Yeah. Should have been done right down there.
So it should have never even gotten to the Supreme Court.
But when you can politicize anything and you can make an agenda out of it, because now it becomes an issue of the First Amendment, which isn't that the one about free speech?
Free speech and freedom of religion.
Yeah. So, but like
So how does her freedom of religion trump the other people's free speech by having a website?
Right.
Someone needs to explain that one too.
Yeah. Yep. It's pretty tough. No matter what side of the spectrum you're on politically, it's pretty tough to argue that there is not an agenda here. Especially this. It's good we ended with this, because this is like the standout.
It's the smoking gun.
Yeah.
You know, not only is it an agenda, it's a poorly thought out, poorly researched, and poorly executed agenda.
And a hateful one.
Yeah, and it's blatant. Like it's like the expectation that Americans are stupid is written into this agenda, because you're not supposed to see this stuff. You're not supposed to pay attention to it. Supreme Court rule. They're supreme, so it should be okay, right? Only we're overturning other Supreme Courts, so it's really not supreme. It's kind of the okay court now.
Yeah.
Just do as we say, though. That's the hypocrisy that our country is dealing with today.
Yeah, and it goes back to that. You know, we talked about the feeling of regression and the feeling of legalized discrimination. And again, we mentioned this a lot. But if you're an audio listener, we're two white guys, so
right.
You know, it's really not impacting us that much. I can't imagine what it must be like being a transgender person or a member of the LGBT community or a minority or a woman. Like, there's just so many people out there that are, and I'm not laughing. I'm laughing because it is so horrible, right? I'm not laughing to make light of it.
Right.
I'm laughing because it is just, it's really bad.
And that's like, it's literally so bad that you don't need to be a member of the community to see how blatant this is and how wrong it is. That's how bad it is at this point.
And it's not even hidden. And then they have the Republican side of this. They tend to like put the blame on the other side of like, oh, well, they're the ones that are trying to take all the power. They're the ones that are actually trying to brainwash you. When in reality, that's just not true.
Right.
It could be in some way, but not nearly as much as the right is doing.
Right.
I just don't know how you can see that and just act like, you know, if you believe in these far right conservative Christian ideas that, like, you know, that you're the minority in this. Like,
so I'm going to get insulting here for a second because I just can't make my point without being insulting. So the people that are doing this, the far right politicians and radicals that are doing this, are so blatant and so callous and not well thought out that their argument requires stupidity to believe, are doing that because the vast majority of people that support right-wing politics are stupid. They're people who don't want to think for themselves, don't want to do their own research, blindly want to follow somebody who they think is the next coming of Jesus, and generally are religious fanatics.
But they think that they are smart because they have backing like this where they're being legitimized.
They think they're smart because the people that know they're stupid keep telling them they're smart.
Yep,
okay.
And that they have all the answers. You have to. I hear this a lot with what I do for a living. Okay, they say, "Oh, you can't trust the Democrats. You can't trust the liberals. They're trying to brainwash you. But you can trust me. Right. I have all the answers." And I'm like, you are no different than if they actually are brainwashing you on the left, because you're doing the exact same thing. You're delegitimizing everything else, but you're saying you have to listen to me. I have all the answers. You can trust me.
Right. They can't provide proof or evidence or a logical argument, so their way of arguing their point is to attack the legitimacy of the other guy.
And it's working.
It's fake news. Don't listen to it. It's political sabotage. It's a witch hunt. It's never me.
Right.
You've got a president, a former president of the United States, with like 50 indictments against him right now.
And he said he's going to run from jail.
And it's not him. It's everybody else.
And it works.
But it doesn't take a genius. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to look at this and say, you're delusional.
Yeah.
Like it can't be that.
Yeah.
But the problem is their supporters don't see logic.
And though it's like when, you know, we talked about earlier when we got on our little aside about voting, right? The types of voters, the people that will vote on party lines. And now you have that with this far right, that they're going to vote. Like, you know, when Trump said he could shoot somebody and get away with it, he was right.
Right.
Like,
exactly. He literally got up on national television and bragged about inappropriately groping a woman.
And then got elected.
And got elected president. They'll vote for him no matter what.
And then they'll do it out of spite.
He gets indicted for violating espionage laws, and he gets $1 million in donations the next day. He gets indicted. Did he get indicted yet for the other one?
I have no idea. We can do another episode on that.
There's so many indictments. It's hard to keep score at this point.
Yeah.
But every time he does something wrong, he gets more supporters.
And if he does go to prison for something, I think it will guarantee that he gets elected. Like it's like the kingpin.
Well, fortunately, there's 2 indictments he's under that if he gets elected, if he gets convicted, he cannot hold public office.
Oh.
Well,
then the Supreme Court will just say that,
then the Supreme Court will reinterpret the Constitution,
Exactly.
I'm sure. So anyway, that's where we're at.
That's the show.
Anyway, yeah, I mean, we don't even have to summarize. It's literally that bad at this point. Before we do go, though, I want to take a moment to push the right button here, which I just did, and invite you to subscribe to the podcast if you don't already do so. You can find audio versions of this podcast listed as Insights into Tomorrow. You can find video and audio versions of all of our network's podcasts listed as Insights into Things. We're available on Pandora, Castro, Podbean, Buzzsprout, pretty much anywhere you can get a podcast these days, but not Stitcher soon. So Stitcher's going away.
Rest in peace, Stitcher.
I would also invite you to contact us. Tell us how we're doing. Argue with us. Tell us we're wrong, that we don't know what we're talking about. I'm take anything at this point in time.
The liberal check is in the mail.
You can email us at comments@insightsintothings.com. We're on Twitter at insights_things. You can find us on Twitch at twitch.tv/insightsintothings 5 days a week. If you have an Amazon Prime subscription, you do get a free monthly Twitch Prime. Throw that our way. We'd appreciate that. Or you can get links to all these and more on our website at www.insightsintothings.com. That's it. Another one in the books.
Stay safe, everybody.
Bye.
Insightful podcasts by informative hosts. Insights into Things, a podcast network. Welcome to Insights into Tomorrow, where we take a deeper look into how the issues of today will impact the world of tomorrow. From politics and world news to media and technology, we discuss how today's headlines are becoming tomorrow's reality.
Welcome to Insights into Tomorrow. This is episode 20, Don't Touch That Dial. I'm your host, Joseph Whalen, and my co-host today, Sam Whalen. How you doing today, Sam?
Good. How you doing?
Fantastic. So this topic kind of came up when I was doing some research on various things that we could talk about. This one kind of hit home, mainly because of what you do. What is it that you do that's tied to this topic?
So I currently am a producer at an AM radio station. I run the board for a bunch of different shows 3 days a week. I also would like to break into the FM market at some point. That's sort of my goal. Went to college for it, did radio in college, did radio in high school. Radio is my passion, and it's what I want to do for a living. This topic was important and something I think about too often.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the resume there. We'll make sure we get
no
that
problem.
out to
Yeah,
everyone.
check out my website.
So, the article that I came across happened to deal with current automakers like BMW, Tesla, Audi, Porsche, and Volvo, all taking steps to remove AM radios from their electric vehicles. And it made me think, and it's making a lot of people think, what's the fate of this aging but reliable form of communication? And that's what we're going to discuss today. But before we do that, I did want to take a moment to invite our listening and viewing audience to subscribe to the podcast. You can find audio versions of this podcast listed as Insights into Tomorrow. You can find video and audio of all the network's podcasts listed as Insights into Things. And we're pretty much anywhere you can get a podcast these days: Apple, Spotify, Google, and so forth. I would also invite you to write in, give us your feedback, tell us how we're doing. You can email us at comments@insightsintothings.com. You can find us on Twitter at insights_things, or you can find links to all of our social media on our main website at www.insightsintothings.com. Shall we get into it?
Let's get into it.
Let's do it. So there's one particular article that I read was on a site, northjersey.com. And they kind of talk about the fact that it's no secret that AM radio has kind of lost much of its luster over the decades. And it was introduced in the early 1900s. And it's lost out to superior technologies, FM being the first one that threatened it, satellite radio, and now we're talking, podcasts and streaming and YouTube and everything you can get over the internet now. In fact, that's one of the things that these car companies are saying, is that everything that you could get over AM, you can get over streaming now in the car, which I guess is a valid point as long as that infrastructure is working, right? AM has been traditionally relegated mostly to talk shows at this point in time. And again, that's because of the limitations in the technology. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with AM and what the limitations of that technology are and why people might be wanting to move away from it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if you listen to any AM broadcast, you're going to hear it immediately, the difference between AM and FM. The sound quality is just much lower, and that has to do a lot with how it transmits its signal. It limits itself, essentially. But because it's so simple, it's effective in more rural areas and areas where you might not have the high-speed internet you would need for streaming services. But again, because of those limitations, like you said, we are mostly talk. Because anything more complicated, you just wouldn't hear it because it's, as it's broadcasted, it's all garbled, and talk is the only thing that really can come through effectively. But yeah, it's kind of a miracle that AM is still around. I think even as someone that works at an AM station, it is definitely, it feels like a relic. And when you bring it up to anybody, you immediately they're like, it's dated and it feels dated. But there is still a market for it in areas where it's not as populated, where it's easy to get an AM signal. We do have people that call in still. We do have listeners, even with those limitations. So,
well, and that's the technology itself doesn't lend itself to high fidelity broadcast, stereo, or all the new fangled high grade music and stuff that we do now. But what it is, it's reliable and it transmits very far. It doesn't, because of the frequencies that it operates on, it's not as susceptible to interference with, objects. Wi-Fi, for instance. You run Wi-Fi in your house, and if you have drywall in your house, that can interfere with your Wi-Fi signals because of the higher frequencies
and weather too.
Yes, that's one thing. But I will say that from a weather standpoint, it's interesting listening to AM radio in a thunderstorm because every time there's a bolt of lightning, you can hear it over the radio.
Yep.
But it's exactly that reliability that resulted in it becoming really America's backbone for our national public warning system, which is one of the paramount reasons that people are trying to preserve it now, not just, for talk radio and such, but a large chunk of our emergency broadcast system is done over AM radio. In fact, our government is still trying to preserve this. U.S. Congressman Josh Geitheimer thinks we can't lose AM radio. He says AM radio is resilient to cyber attacks, nuclear threat, and natural disasters. He goes on to say that when cell phones go out, the internet gets cut off or television doesn't work because there's no power in your house. You can still use an AM radio. It'll still be there.
Yep.
And that's true. I mean, people have hand crank AM radios for emergency weather services and natural disasters and things like that. How significant do you think it would be if AM went away and we lost those forms of communication? Would it be a public health hazard?
I think it definitely could be because, I mean, when all else fails, you would still be able to turn to that. Everybody, even if they've never tuned to AM on their car or radio before, you can, and you would still be able to get that information. If that goes away, there really is no no like last resort that you'd be able to go to get that information. You could, we get government warnings on our phones, but if there's some kind of electrical malfunction, your phone is dead. And there's no cell service, no internet service. You're not going to get those alerts. TV broadcasts, you see emergency alert system tests on TV all the time. But again, if power goes out or if the TV networks go out, you're going to lose that service. AM radio, it's pretty hard to shut it down unless you destroy the transmitting towers because no matter what, it's going to go out. And like you said, you can get a hand cranked radio to always get that signal. So I think it would be, it seems like a really low chance that we'd have to use it for something. But if we did and we didn't have it, the consequences would be pretty rough.
Well, and, I'll take us back to when 9/11 happened. I was working up in central New Jersey, so most of the radio and TV stations that we had pulled from New York. And when the first tower went down, it took one of the major transmitting stations for all the television networks down.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, and because it was mounted on top of the tower, because it was the largest structure in the city. And we lost all of the antenna service that we had at the time. We didn't have cable; we had antenna service, and obviously, it's a time that everyone's kind of scared, not knowing what's going on. So you're looking to get news. Well, all the internet sites were hammered at the time. You couldn't get anything. In fact, the only internet news we could get, we had to go to European sites to get that, and they had spotty reporting at best. We had someone who had an old 9-volt radio in their desk that they would listen to on their break. And they pulled that out. They pulled up an AM news station, and that was how we kept in touch during 9/11. So it's not that unreasonable to think that it's that important. And it's, the whole reason this topic came up was because of the auto industry kind of pushing the issue itself. But that's not really the driving force behind this, but it's the reasoning behind the auto industry's move away from AM is sketchy, I would say, at best. What are the reasonings that they have for moving away from AM?
So I'm looking at the show notes. I'm just trying to make sure we covered the right parts. We already covered the issues, but yeah, the real issue is deeper than car makers trying to modernize their products. This is from Forbes magazine. 40% of all radio listening is done in cars, which is great for us and the radio side of things because you're guaranteed an audience. A lot of, like when you do ratings and stuff, you can't guarantee an audience, but radio, you can kind of cheese the numbers because everyone's got a radio in their car. Even if they're not really listening, it's on. So that counts when it comes to ratings.
Sure, yeah.
If the auto industry turns away from AM, losing that large percentage of listeners could doom the platform and make it impossible to stay commercially viable, which is also very true because in radio, it all comes down to your ratings so that you can sell advertising to then go back into the station to fund more things. It's a cycle. And ratings are everything. If you don't have those ratings and you don't have that market, you've pretty much got no reason to be operational because it is all commercial based, even if it is being used for government services. Bipartisan groups of elected leaders have sponsored the AM for Every Vehicle Act, which I imagine is, a bill to force AM in every car, no matter what.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think that would be a good thing, because even if you never use it, like you said, when it comes to 9/11, having it in a time like that would be extremely useful and helpful. And if there was no option for that, I don't know what you would do. I think it would make panic even worse than it probably already would be.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think it's almost like a safety blanket at this point in time. People know that if they need to get that information, they can, even though they might not avail themselves of it on a regular basis. There's thousands and thousands of weather radios out there that people have just when there's a storm, and those weather radios get their information over an AM band. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that the auto industry is claiming is that because of the electrical emissions from electrical vehicles, it causes interference over AM radios, and they don't want a negative experience for their users
that are listening to AM radio.
That
Like that Venn diagram is pretty small.
That's a very good point. Is that the fact that they've got people that are listening to AM radios are clearly not looking for a high fidelity signal to begin with.
Yeah, I don't think, like I said, the Venn diagram of electric car users and AM radio listeners are that in between is, I would argue, probably non-existent.
and I would tend to agree with that as well. So, and that's why I say I think their motivation for it's to save money, but I can't imagine that putting an AM capable radio in an electric vehicle is the cost center.
Well, it's also probably because they want to have a deal with satellite radio companies, because most times when you buy a car now, it's got Sirius built into it, Sirius XM.
Well, yeah, but my vehicle has Sirius built into it. They didn't have to not have AM on it.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why they wouldn't do it. Maybe if it's I don't think it's an electrical interference problem. I just don't buy that.
I don't either, and that's almost like one of those things where they don't want you to use your cell phone on an airplane,
right,
because it interferes with telemetry. And it's like, yes, if under certain circumstances there's a 1 in a million chance that it interferes with it, you probably don't want that chance happening on a plane. I can't imagine there being anything detrimental about an AM radio that's just receiving, not transmitting,
right,
on an electric vehicle.
Yeah, and like I have a AM radio transmitter hooked up to my stereo, or a receiver hooked up to my stereo, and it's just like a square piece of plastic with wire wrapped around it. That's all you need to get AM signal. It's not like you need a full stereo or radio head to get it.
Right.
You just need some wire that you stick out.
And it's funny you mention that, because during that 9/11 situation, the radio that we had was not getting a very good signal. So we actually took a piece of coax, stripped all the shielding off of it, and just turned that into a bigger antenna and got a clearer signal.
Yeah, and like that's one of the reasons I love radio so much. Not just AM. I don't really love AM that much, but FM, radio in general, the concept of radio. It's so accessible, and I've always equated it to like sticking your hand in a river. Like the radio is always there, and there's so many ways to access it. And you could have a big boombox that you tune your favorite station to, but you can also have something in the palm of your hand that can do the same thing. And I just think like you don't really get that with any other medium. Not to mention it's very like personable. Like when you're listening to a DJ, it feels like it's just you and them having a conversation, and you don't get that with TV or movies.
Sure.
And I think AM does have that, and that's another reason why talk is so successful on AM when it is because you can access it in a variety of ways that are pretty easy, and you don't have to pay to listen to the radio. Like you don't have to pay a subscription fee. You can just have a wire and stick it up in the air and have some sort of output, and you're listening. There's no barrier to entry, and that's one of the reasons I love it so much. And it's so accessible no matter where you are in life. I just think it's great.
Well, and it's funny because there's been a push by politicians to declare internet as a public utility. Everyone needs to have internet. And I don't want to argue with that. I mean, that's our medium of choice for the podcast. And I think everyone should have it. But if everyone should have the internet as a public service, everyone should have AM. Mm-hmm. AM already exists. Why would you take it away?
And it's much easier to give everybody access to AM than it is internet.
Absolutely.
Because the less populated areas you get, it's way harder to get that internet working. I have a friend of mine who lives in Maine, and his two choices for internet were Spectrum or like satellite internet, which is way worse.
Right.
And the delay in that is insane. And this is in 2023, and he's not even in like a rural area. It's just in Maine. There's still parts of the country where you're not getting 5G, upload speeds and things like that. And, that's going to be a problem for many more years to come. They're not going to have that ironed out. Certainly not in a way that it works as reliably as AM does now.
Well, and that's sort of what the auto industry is kind of counting on, is people getting this information over the internet. And the problem with the model of the internet is it's cost-centric to the consumer, where if you want the internet, you have to pay for it in some form, either through taxes, through direct subscriptions, or whatever, whereas AM is producer-centric. So if someone wants to produce content and put it out on radio, they have to fund it. Mm-hmm. They fund it through listenership and through advertising, but there's no cost, like you said, to the consumer at that point in time. So it makes it accessible to low-income people, to seniors, to everybody out there who doesn't have unlimited income and free disposable income.
And going back to that accessibility thing, it's pretty easy to understand. It's a dial.
Sure. You flip it on and you turn it to where you want to listen to something.
Yeah, and it's just, I don't think there's any other like medium of communication that's like it, and I think that's the reason it's still around. It's people say the radio industry is dying, and I don't think it's dying. I think it's just changing. I think it's evolving. But I think the core technology of how FM and AM transmission works, I think there's always going to be a place for that as long as, broadcasting towers still exist.
Well, the fact that you have podcasts that have become so popular tells me that the content that comes over AM is still popular. The medium may be changing,
Right.
but that content is still deliverable. It's ease of use, it's low cost, and it's accessible to everybody. It makes a lot of sense to keep it around for people who aren't high tech and have disposable income to pay for the content that they're looking for. There's a market for all the other stuff, and there's nothing to take away from that. But AM still serves a huge portion of the public, and I think it's probably worthwhile to keep it around.
Yeah, absolutely.
On that note, I think we're going to take our first break, and we'll come back and we'll talk about why AM is so important. We'll be right back. For over 7 years, the Second Sith Empire has been the premier community guild in the online game Star Wars: The Old Republic. With hundreds of friendly and helpful active members, a weekly schedule of nightly events, annual guild meet and greets, and an active community both on the web and on Discord. The Second Sith Empire is more than your typical gaming group. We're family. Join us on the Starforge server for nightly events such as operations, flashpoints, world boss hunts, Star Wars trivia, guild lottery, and much more. Visit us on the web today at www.thesecondsithempire.com.
Welcome back, everyone, to Insights into Tomorrow. Today we're talking about AM radio and the value of it in today's modern world. So in this segment, we're going to talk about why AM radio is so important. Like I said at the top of the show, I am a producer at an AM radio station, so you can take that however you want. They're not paying me to say this, though. They're barely paying me to work. So some members of the right-leaning media, such as Sean Hannity, suggest the phasing out of AM could be a conspiracy to silence conservative voices. And boy, does that sound like a narrative we've heard before. Many right-leaning talk shows that are the key to the Republican base live on AM. That's very, very true. A lot of the shows that I run are like that. And they are just more popular than a lot of the other shows we get because they have that built-in audience, essentially. Why would... We have a note in here about Elon Musk. Isn't Elon Musk emerging as a leader of the right? Why would Tesla be participating in this conspiracy? That's a good point. Elon clearly is on the right side when it comes to the political spectrum. Going back to the EV vehicles wanting to get rid of AM radio, why would he be doing that if it's a constant echo chamber for right-leaning ideas? I don't know. That's a good question. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't. It makes me go back to the thought that it's a cost savings thing, but I don't know how you're saving money on it by getting rid of it. What other motivation would he have other than making sure that other medium, he owns Twitter too. So maybe it's a way of trying to make sure that the mediums that he favors more are at the forefront, removing. And I don't want to get into conspiracy theories here, but one of the things that right-leaning side of the country seems to think is that if they eliminate options for people and the only options that you have left to adopt are the options that they want you to adopt, then you obviously wind up following their indoctrination.
Right.
Is this a factor of that? I doubt it. I think that's kind of a stretch, but I think it's more of a technology thing. Like, I don't even know what kind of radio a Tesla has at this point in time because it's a computer interface that it has.
Yeah, I have no idea. But I could see Elon being more of the mind of, there's a ton of right wing stuff on like YouTube and their own sites that are getting plenty of traffic. And I could see Elon being completely fine with just moving past AM entirely to focus more on that digital side of things. Guys like I'm not even going to mention their names, but you know who they are, the guys that are, on that side of the spectrum that are online doing their shows. They're basically doing an AM talk radio show just on the internet, and they're getting way more eyes on than they would ever get on AM. So I could see Elon just being of the mindset that AM is dead and we'll just move on from it.
Well, and let's be honest, the format that we do on this show here is very well suited, with the exception of the video, obviously, but it's very well suited to being on an AM radio station. Which is why I say, like, the most popular podcasts that are out there today are really an AM podcast. They're an AM talk show that happens to be on the internet. So there isn't a lack of demand for what AM offers from a format standpoint. Is it just a technology thing?
I mean, yeah. Once again, we go back to this issue of technology. Jordan Walton, executive director of the New Jersey Broadcasters Association, tells us, due to the nature of the sound, AM lends itself to the spoken word, which is why the talk shows gravitate toward it, which is true. When I'm producing shows, we are very aware that we are spoken word when it comes to things like compression rate and what we're uploading our shows at. It really doesn't matter that much because when it's processed through the transmitter, it's going to sound like it sounds on AM no matter what we do to it. Hundreds of foreign language stations on the platform serve marginalized communities, which is also very true. I run a lot of shows dealing with Eastern European communities in the area, Ukrainian people, Polish people, and that was an aspect of the radio industry that I had no idea about before I started this job, and it's really opened my eyes to it, how important it is to these communities to have that access. I mean, holding full-on religious services that through the AM dial that they might not be able to get to otherwise. It's a big deal, and it's in those communities. It is still very active, and of course, nearly 47 million Americans listen to AM, which is a lot of people. And if that just happened to go away, that's 47 million people that just lose access to that platform.
Yeah, and I go back to when I was a kid. My grandmother lived with us. She was from, as my mother used to term it, the old country. She was from Lithuania. And she didn't speak English very well, didn't understand English very well. So she was very self-conscious going out in public because she couldn't communicate. There happened to be at the time a radio station, a local AM radio station that she would listen to that was done, I don't know if it was done in Lithuanian, but it was done in a language that she understood. Mm-hmm. And that was like her connection to the outside world. She would get religious services through it. She would get news through it. It was a friendly voice that she didn't hear unless she was talking to members of her own community. And that level of cultural sensitivity, I think, is very important to maintain for those marginalized people.
Absolutely. I mean, some of the shows that we run are entirely in other languages, entirely in Polish or entirely in Ukrainian. And, I don't speak those languages, but somebody's listening because otherwise they wouldn't be on the air.
Right. So, and as with everything, cost is still a factor. As a platform, AM's comparatively inexpensive, certainly to produce and create content for. AM's also the great equalizer across drastically divergent economic situations. From a millionaire to a Porsche, from a millionaire in a Porsche to a homeless person with a battery radio, anyone can tune in, is the quote that I found.
And that's kind of what I talked about earlier, the accessibility of it. There's no subscription fee. As long as you have a way to receive the transmission, because they're all around you. You can't see them, obviously, but, FM signals and AM signals are all around you. As long as you've got a way to...
You can't see them. I can see them.
I think you got to see a doctor. As long as you've got a way to receive that, you can access it. And I think that's a wonderful thing.
You're absolutely right. And again, talking about your friend who's in Maine and other people, you've got farmers and seniors and immigrants who all rely on it because it's a cheap cost of entry into getting into these areas, these discussions. You don't need any high-tech gear. You don't need any advanced knowledge of computers. You literally flip a button, turn it on, turn the knob to where you want to go, and it's there. So that accessibility makes it appealing to a lot of people. Probably the most significant reason AM is important, again, we touched on earlier, is a means of emergency communication. Severe weather alerts, Amber alerts, and other emergency broadcasts all go out over AM frequencies. Now, a lot of those you can get over your cell phone now too, but in times of emergencies, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, the technology required to make the internet work, and you know, full disclosure, I think everyone knows by now, I work in technology, I work with the internet. The fact that it works as well as it does is a miracle. There are so many points of failure that can stop the internet from working, especially when you're talking about cell signals, that in times of a natural disaster, it's literally the first thing to go down. FEMA has spent decades building out its integrated public alert warning system, or its IPAWS system, using somewhere in the range of 77 primary emergency alerting stations around the country that are AM-based stations. So you've got a huge infrastructure for emergency broadcasting that's already been invested by the country to build this out, and it works. I think that's my biggest catch is there's no reason not to use it. It's not like it's failing. It's not like our crumbling road infrastructure where bridges are literally falling down within driving distance of us here. This works. The technology is sufficient enough to do the job that it's doing, and there's no reason not to use it. The stations brought vital information, warnings, and comfort during tragedies like hurricanes and earthquakes, and again, in the wake of 9/11. So I can't think of a compelling reason for AM to go away. The fact that it's an old technology shouldn't be a reason. The wheel is an old technology, and that's not going away because it's thousands of years old, right?
Yeah, I don't really see why you'd get rid of it. I mean, it still works. It's worked essentially the same way for like 100 years at this point. I forget when it was invented. I think in the early 1900s, but like it still works, especially when it comes to things like this. Why would you get rid of it? And what is the alternative? Really, like, is there a plan from these automakers for? I guess they don't really. It's not their problem if AM radios are done away with. What the alternative would be for these kind of emergency broadcasts?
No, it's not. And their solution to this is use an app. And I'm sorry, but there isn't an app for the emergency broadcasting system. There isn't an app that works when the internet goes down or your cellular connection goes down. The technology of the internet. And it's ironic because when the concept of the internet came out after Sputnik launched, the idea was to move away from circuit-switched telephone networks that could be taken out in a nuclear strike to a packet switch network which can route around outages on the network. So the whole premise of the internet was to have a redundant system of communication that didn't go down during emergencies. And the first thing that goes down in times of emergencies is your local internet connection. Mm-hmm. Like it happens every time. You know, we have gusty storms here and our cable internet goes out or the power goes out. And it's like there's so many things that an internet connection is dependent on that if any one of those goes down, whether it's your power at your house, your router, the wire to your house, the wire on the street, the wire back to the central office, there's so many things that could go out that would take down your internet. And if you think about the technology for AM, what do you have? You have the radio station and their antenna. Mm-hmm. They're the only two things that you need. And you could set up a portable AM radio broadcasting station within an hour of a natural disaster. Mm-hmm. So the level of redundancy isn't anywhere near where it is with AM.
Yeah, just like a personal anecdote. I remember there was one time when I was younger, we got stuck in traffic somewhere. It was like standstill traffic. And the first thing you did was tune to AM.
That was the New Jersey Turnpike, the Pennsylvania Turnpike coming back from Hershey.
Yep. And the first thing you do was you tune to one of our local AM stations to get the traffic. And they did traffic and weather like every 20 minutes, maybe less than that, every 15 minutes. But that was the first thing it did because it was reliable, and we might not at the time had, as up-to-date, Google Maps as we do now, but it was a way that you knew that you could count on to get that information pretty much immediately and effectively, and it worked without any kind of issue.
Yeah, so I don't think there's a huge danger of AM going away. What concerns me more is the fact that you have manufacturers that are marginalizing it now. It's one thing to lose market share to a superior technology when the product that you're trying to consume, like music, relies on that superior technology. If you listen to a radio, the same song on AM and on FM, you can hear the difference. Losing market share to that is understandable because you're getting a higher quality product.
Right.
Losing market share just because some auto manufacturer decides that they don't want to put a radio in your car anymore, that's pretty arbitrary at that point in time. And you're taking the choice out of the hands of the consumer at that point.
Yeah, and again, we've hit this a bunch, but like it doesn't cost that much. It can't cost that much. I have an FM and AM receiver hooked up to my stereo, and it's just 2 wires. Like I don't understand like what the argument. It's not like it's costing hundreds of thousands of dollars to install these devices in cars. It can't cost that much, you know. And it's just like, why get rid of it? I don't understand it.
Yeah, no, I agree. We're going to take another break here, and we come back. We're going to talk about how it can be saved, because we're not the only ones that think it should be. There are other people, fortunately, in positions of power who think it should be saved. We'll be back in a minute.
Insights into Entertainment, a podcast series taking a deeper look into entertainment and media. Our husband and wife team of pop culture fanatics are exploring all things from music and movies to television and fandom. We'll look at the interesting and obscure entertainment news of the week. We'll talk about theme park and pop culture news. We'll give you the latest and greatest on pop culture conventions. We'll give you a deep dive into Disney, Star Wars, and much more. Check out our video episodes at youtube.com/insightsintothings. Our audio episodes at podcast.insightsintoentertainment.com, or check us out on the web at insightsintothings.com.
Welcome back to Insights into Tomorrow. We're talking about AM radio and people fighting to get rid of it. Well, back in 2013, Ajit Pai of the FCC saw the problem looming and embarked on a personal quest to save it. After a little more than a year in the job, he urged the FCC to undertake an overhaul of the AM radio, which he called the audible core of our national culture. He sees AM as vital in emergencies and in rural areas. He goes on to say AM radio is localism. It's community. AM's longer wavelength means that it can be heard at far greater distances, let's try that again. AM's longer wavelength means it can be heard at far greater distances, and so increases. He said AM radio is always going to be there. For example, he cited Fort Yukon, Alaska, where the AM station KZPA broadcasts inquiries about missing hunters and transmits flood alerts during the annual spring ice breakup. I can't imagine there being an app for that that's reliable out in Fort Yukon, Alaska.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you think about this? The chairman of the FCC is fighting for this.
Yeah, I mean, that's good. It's good that someone is. Ajit Pai is a questionable guy in most aspects of what he does politically, but this seems like something that is a positive thing that he's doing. You know, it's good that he is sticking up for it, and, we'll see, if that continues and what his support would actually mean in terms of keeping AM radio around. But, having the head of the FCC, or I don't think he's the head of the FCC.
Not anymore, no.
When he was, still having him advocate for that. But, it's good to know that there are people higher up that are fighting for it for whatever reason. It's better to have it than not have it at all.
What about Congress? What's Congress doing for us?
So they are trying to save AM radio as well, with automakers threatening to pull the plug. A backlash by station owners, listeners, and legislators prompted Ford to announce it was reversing course on its previous announcement to stop installing AM radios in its cars. But with Tesla and the EV manufacturers announcing their intentions to phase out the technology, A congressional subcommittee was debating the merits of proposed legislation to make AM receivers standard equipment on new vehicles. So they just were talking about it, I guess. That's what it sounds like.
I think that's what politicians normally do.
Removing AM radios from cars could dramatically reduce the audience, with 74% of AM listening happening in the car, according to Nielsen. Automakers cite audio interference. We covered a little bit of this with electrical motors and the ability to stream stations as justification for phasing out the AM radios, which we already said the market for AM listeners and EV users is probably really small. The Communications and Technology Subcommittee of the Energy and Commerce Committee, the ECC, heard nearly 3 hours of testimony as to why AM should be saved. That must have been a long 3 hours.
I'll bet that was a real snorefest.
We mentioned this earlier, but the AM Radio for Every Vehicle Act would require, quote, dashboard access to any AM broadcast stations in a, quote, manner that is conspicuous to a driver. The primary rationale is AM radio's integral role in alerting the public of emergencies situations as part of a national network. So again, it goes back to this thing of, if it's not broke, why do we get rid of it? And if it's something that we could use in an emergency where we can't really count on anything else, why get rid of it? And I think that's really what it comes down to. Even if, getting rid of the entertainment side of it, the talk radio side of it, at the end of the day, it is a utility, right? That it is used for emergency purposes. And it would be like getting rid of emergency alert systems in general. Something on that scale, like, these are important for in times of crisis, and it's something that is a reliable way to make sure that people get the information they need to know to stay safe. Why would we get rid of that?
I agree. And the subcommittee even goes on to talk about what we had discussed earlier, that there's a lot of programming on AM radio that'll have no place to go if AM dies a quicker than natural death. Mm-hmm. Of course, that's assuming that, there is a natural death in the future for AM to begin with. But Tesla hasn't been including AM radios in their vehicles for years.
I didn't know that.
And now a number of other manufacturers are kind of following suit there. They claim the electromagnetic interference from batteries generates an audible high-frequency hum for AM broadcast signals. What doesn't generate an audible high-frequency hum on AM? Everything does.
Yep.
But it's been around for over 120 years now. Everyone's gotten used to it at this point in time.
Right.
It's literally, microwave background radiation from the cosmos generates it, okay? I don't think your car is going to overpower that.
Yeah.
But when Ford announced that they would stop putting AM radios in, somebody finally perked up and took notice. Ford CEO Jim Farley said after speaking with policy leaders about the importance of AM broadcast radio as part of the emergency alert system, we've decided to include it in all of 2024 Ford and Lincoln vehicles.
It's a great quote. Like, we forgot about the emergency alert system part. I guess we'll put them in.
Yeah, at least they realized it. But the longer term future for AM kind of is up in the air there still. They're only doing it in their 2024 line. Clearly that's not a long-term plan of theirs. So we need more.
Yeah.
So what more do we have?
A petition.
There's a petition out there for everything, right?
They always work.
So change.org Save AM Radio, a part of the emergency alert system petition, has been put up by WABC Radio, actually.
Like the ABC?
Yeah.
Oh, how about that?
Yeah, as if they had some kind of stake in the race or something here. Again, they're pushing the fact that for emergency purposes, because, we're getting more and more weather events,
Yep.
which means there's more and more need for this. Again, is it profit for them that they're pushing this to keep it around because they make money off of AM?
I've been trying to find a way to articulate this, but I really do think it goes back to the issue of satellite radio, right? Because I think they probably see AM as not profitable and not worth having in the car. I don't think they really consider the emergency alert aspect of it. But I think if they have a partnership with Sirius where Sirius pays them and they pay Sirius to have Sirius XM in the car when you buy it, I think that is, I think there's something to be said there of why they're pushing to get rid of AM so hard. FM is going to be a tougher sell because people do still pretty regularly listen to FM radio. But I think it starts by getting rid of AM.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. But I don't know if satellite radio is a replacement for AM.
Well, not in a realistic sense, but I think in terms of profitability sense for them, for the manufacturers.
From that standpoint, yeah, but from an emergency alert system itself, I don't think it's reliable enough for that.
No, not at all. Not to mention you have to pay a subscription for it. So
well, and that's the thing. Like what someone like XM could do would be to provide a channel that anyone can access for emergency regions.
Yep.
The problem that you have with that is your emergency broadcast system is regionalized.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to have a single channel for emergency broadcast, Fort Yukon, Alaska is going to be sending me updates of hunters that are missing and breaking up with their ice cap, and it's not going to be relevant to me.
Yeah, not to mention, I don't know how you would access that without having like Sirius installed in your car.
And that's the thing. Standard radios can't receive it, whereas literally any standard AM radio can receive an AM broadcast.
Right.
You can get add-ons, that will do. You can get an AM or a XM tuner that then broadcasts an FM signal that you can pick up, which is what a lot of people did for satellite radio when it first came out. But again, it's ease of use. That's not available to everybody, so I don't think it's probably the best way to go about it either.
Yep.
I don't know. I guess time will tell where we are with it, but we're going to take another break here and come back. We're going to talk about why AM is fading and some detailed information on that. We'll be right back.
Insights into Teens, a podcast series exploring the issues and challenges of today's youth. Talking to real teens about real teen problems. Explore issues from braces to puberty, social anxiety to financial responsibility. Each week, we talk about the topics concerning today's youth. We look at how the issues affect teens, how to cope with these issues, and how parents, friends, and loved ones can help teens handle these challenges. Check out our video episodes on youtube.com/insightsintothings. Catch our audio versions on podcast.insightsintoteens.com or on the web at insightsintothings.com.
So is AM radio dying? Well, AM listenership has been in decline for years now. It's been losing ground to cleaner sounds of FM radio and more recently satellite radio and digital media like podcasts.
Mm-hmm. Make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube, everybody.
I guess that makes us part of the problem. But there's over 4,500 AM radio stations nationwide and about 82 million listeners each month. About a third of the audiences for terrestrial radio, according to Nielsen. I didn't realize it was that large. I mean, that's a pretty significant amount, especially when you start talking about advertising revenue.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see how that maps out on a region, like on a map, like where a lot of these people are concentrated in, if it is more rural areas or if it's more spread out. If I had to wager, I'd say it's probably more like open areas where it's, more popular because it's a reliable form that you can always access.
Well, the research that I did says in Chicago, AM listeners represent 48% of the total monthly radio audience. Just skimming here.
Yeah, it's a lot of numbers.
I love stats, but I don't like picking up numbers. It's tied to Milwaukee and second only to Buffalo at 56%. So you're talking big city areas here where you got a lot of listeners. Mm-hmm. And, these are coming from Nielsen ratings here. Once towering top 40 stations like WLS AM 890. I feel like I should be doing it in some
Hey, everybody.
My radio announcer voice.
WLS AM 890.
They switched to the talk format more than 3 decades ago and currently ranks 23rd in Chicago with a 1.7 share. No, I don't know what Nielsen ratings are. Does 1.7 mean anything to you?
I have no idea. Share of the market, probably, if I had to guess.
Okay. But, a little bit closer to home, you have Philadelphia-based Odyssey which owns two of the top-rated AM stations in Chicago. They talked to, the article I read talked to Craig Schwab, an Illinois native and veteran radio news executive who took the reins at WBBAM in January. He spent most of his career in AM radio, which, you know, near and dear to your heart, I suppose.
Yeah, it was probably a little bit more popular when he started, though.
He declined to break down the AM/FM audience that split up the station, but said the reach of AM signal is crucial for a news station, especially in emergencies. He goes on to say, I've covered a bunch of hurricanes in my time. I don't know how many hurricanes in Chicago you cover, but okay.
More than you think.
In different radio markets. Sorry, okay. He says in different radio markets.
It's the Windy City. So.
He says, I'll tell you that when electricity goes down and cell towers are out and all kinds of things aren't possible, television's not accessible, cell phone signals and batteries die, AM radio is there. And it is. It's like a safety blanket.
Mm-hmm. A really uncomfortable, scratchy safety blanket. Like the one you leave in your car if you get stuck on the side of the road.
Keeps you alive, though, right?
Yeah,
You're not gonna sleep with it normally, but you know, it gets the job done. And I think that's really what it's like, is, you know, that's kind of the gist of it. So, given your experience with being a AM producer, I want to throw a couple of questions at you in the last few minutes of the show here and do a little question and answer session. So the first question I had for you is, should AM be kept alive? And if so, why?
You know, they taught me in journalism school not to ask yes or no questions. But yeah, I definitely think it should be, not just because I'd be out of a job, but because, you know, when it comes down to it, you know, like I said before, throwing all the talk, all the entertainment stuff out the window when it comes to AM, I think it fundamentally is most important for its emergency broadcast capability. And if you were to get rid of that, I don't know how you would replace that. Like we talked about, internet is not reliable, television is not reliable, not as reliable as AM. And if it's not there, how are those messages going to get out at the end of the day? I think it would be a public security risk, honestly.
And I think that's a fair point. And it kind of leads me into the next question here is, should government intervene in keeping AM radio alive for that very reason? Now, I'm not an advocate on government intervention. I think every time the government gets involved in something, it's more likely to get screwed up and cost me more money than it is to fix anything. But because of that public safety aspect of it, is this a government problem? Should the government be doing something to make sure this doesn't go away?
I think that's a slippery slope, honestly. You know, when you've got government, if they're going to intervene with car manufacturers, I think that could go... I think it could send a bad message, and it could set a dangerous precedent for what government could do in the future. If they're going to intervene with something like this, where could they intervene in the future? However, I mean, something's got to be done, right? If Tesla doesn't even have AM now, so if you're in a Tesla, how are you going to get that transmission? They can't send every American a little tiny hand crank AM radio. You know, I think that.
I don't know. I think you can afford it.
I think in an instance like this, yeah, whether it's directly intervening with the auto manufacturers or whether it's finding some other way to get these transmissions out reliably, I think that, you know, they've got to do something.
Well, and that's really the kind of the ultimate follow-up question is, what can government do? Should government regulate what auto manufacturers can do? Should they subsidize? If it's a cost issue, should the government subsidize the cost of AM radios? Or should the government mandate we not buy these cars? Like what else can the government do other than either legislate the car industry or regulate the car industry or subsidize it?
Yeah, I really have no idea. I mean, it would have to be, again, there's always the thing of finding an alternative way to get these messages out, but I don't know what that would be. Large, like, speakers all around the country that would broadcast these signals if something happened. I have no idea. You know, it's a tough question to answer.
So you know, I think that is another alternative, is the government can find another medium for it for emergency broadcasts. So the next question I have is kind of a personal question to you: is do you listen to AM radio in your car, and why or why not?
I do sometimes if I want to hear what's going on at my job just for fun, because we mess stuff up all the time. So it's nice to hear if I know who's working, if I know who's messing stuff up. But otherwise, no. The sound quality is it's too big of a hurdle for me to get over. I've been listening to FM radio my whole life. So it's really that it comes down to an issue of quality. I just can't get past it.
And I'll be honest with you, I used to listen to AM radio. I used to listen to sports talk radio all the time. There's a local station here, 610, that I used to listen to.
That closed down. I work for some of those people now.
But the majority of that type of discussion has moved into the FM frequencies now. So I don't listen to sports radio anymore, but if I did, I'd be listening to it on FM. And I think that's kind of a natural migration of the mediums themselves. There's no reason for them to be on FM other than quality, maybe more accessibility, maybe. I don't know. Did they move from AM to FM because they saw this happening and they realized that it was time to move?
Well, like most things in life, it's also a question of money, right? You have a way bigger advertising market when it comes to FM than you do AM. So these shows, when they move to FM, they can sell more ads, they can have more listeners, and that cycle can continue on a bigger scale than when they're on AM.
That's a very good point. So kind of back to the issue at hand here. Will not having AM radios in cars kill the medium of AM radio?
Well, it certainly wouldn't help. We had the stat a while ago in the show notes, and I can't find it, but it was like more than 50% of listening for AM is in the car. So if that's taken away, where else are people going to listen? I think just from those numbers alone, if you're losing more than half your listening audience, that's going to be tough to come back from. And, asking people to either stream it online, which we do offer, which alleviates the quality problem, by the way. But then you run into the issue of having internet instead of just having a radio. I think it would. Yeah, I really do. I think losing that large of a chunk of your listener base would be tough to come back from.
Well, if we're talking about AM, keeping AM around just for the sake of it being an emergency service, do you need listenership when you don't have an emergency, though?
I mean, you got to keep the lights on, right? I mean, these things, unless you're being funded directly by the government, you got to keep the lights on.
That's that subsidy I was talking about, where the government's going to basically pay for the service.
I think that'd be the only way around it.
Okay. And the last question that I had, and we can kind of wrap things up, what is the future of AM radio if it can be saved today? Is there a long-term future, short-term? Is it relegated to emergencies? Is there still a consumer-grade version of AM 20 years from now?
20 years from now, I don't know. I think by then it might move more to podcasting. I think if it's going to stick around, it's going to, in 20 years, it would probably be more for just emergency purposes. Especially during COVID, a lot of stuff got cut around here. A lot of stations closed down because the small listener base they already had got even smaller because there was a lot more limiting of what we could do because everything was shut down. I think in 20 years, it'd probably be more something akin to purely for emergency purposes.
Well, and I have to say, from a strictly podcasting standpoint, one of the biggest advantages of podcasting is literally, if you don't care too much about quality and production quality, literally anybody can podcast. And I know AM has a low barrier of cost of entry to get into, but it's not free. And podcasting's not free either. But you could generate a podcast on your phone if you wanted to.
Yeah.
So it's a lot easier for people to produce content from that and then publish it somewhere on free sites. Again, you're talking about a different audience and a different barrier to entry for your consumers for it. But as a podcaster, well, I can't say it's cheap to podcast because the level that we podcast on is very expensive. But for someone who just wants to create an audio podcast and doesn't want to go crazy with mixers and mics and all that stuff, you can do it for next to nothing.
Yep.
You can produce content on the internet for next to nothing. Can AM radio claim the same thing? Like, what's your cost for someone if they want to produce this type of show, just audio on AM? What would something like this cost roughly?
Well, I mean, it would be dependent because how we do things is people pay us to be on the air, so we basically facilitate. We give them the studio, and then they buy the time to talk. It would be what we've got is on the level of this. Minus we don't have any video components, but in terms of the audio quality, we have the same, if not slightly better, audio equipment there. And a lot of it is the built-in audience you're getting by being on the AM station. You've already got our built-in listener base. Now, is that would depend on what your product is, what your podcast is about, if that listener base is going to listen to that. So I think that's, you'd have to probably look at your market and your demographics from that. But that's really what it is getting that built-in audience, getting that guaranteed transmission from the same time every week or whenever you would want it. And I think that's the biggest selling point. And, we go back to the reliability of AM and the accessibility of it. If you're broadcasting on AM, people might have an easier way of accessing your content that might not be familiar with how to access things on the internet or how to access things, on YouTube or things like that.
Okay, I think that's a fair point. So there's certain trade-offs. There's not a one-to-one comparison between the two. Okay, I mean, I think we've kind of drawn this out to a kind of a conclusion of wait and see at this point. It's not going anywhere anytime soon, but the future isn't bright for it.
No, I would not. No, I would say it's not bright. No.
So appreciate the AM radio that you have now, I guess.
Cherish it, yes, and mail them money. I don't know, just envelopes full of cash,
buckets and buckets.
Yep.
All right, I think that's all we have for today. Before we did go, I want to take an opportunity once again to invite folks to subscribe to the audio and video versions of the podcast. You can find audio versions of this podcast listed as Insights into Tomorrow. Both audio and video can be found listed as Insights into Things. We are on anywhere you can get a podcast, Pandora, Amazon, TuneIn. One thing I would ask, though, that we haven't been pushing for is if you can, give us a rating, give us a thumbs up, give us a review if you want. Let people know what kind of program we produce here, what kind of quality we have. I'd even take constructive feedback, constructive criticism if there's things that we can do better. We're always looking to improve things. You can write us that directly to us. You can email us at comments@insightsintothings.com. You can hit us on Twitter at Twitter Yeah, okay. Don't comment on that one, though. You can hit us on Twitter at insights_things. You can find us on Twitch, streaming 5 days a week at twitch.tv/insightsintothings. Just a side note, if you do have an Amazon Prime subscription, you do get a free monthly Twitch Prime subscription. You can throw that our way. That would help us out a lot. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/insightsintothingspodcast or on Instagram at insightsintothings, or you can find all these links and more on our website at www.insightsintothings.com. And that's it. Another one in the books.
Stay safe out there, everybody.
Bye.
Insightful podcasts by informative hosts. Insights into Things, a podcast network. Welcome to Insights into Tomorrow, where we take a deeper look into how the issues of today will impact the world of tomorrow. From politics and world news to media and technology, we discuss how today's headlines are becoming tomorrow's reality.
Hello, everyone. Welcome into Insights into Tomorrow, episode 19, The State of Microsoft Games. My name is Sam Whalen. I'll be your host today, and alongside me is my co-host, Mr. Joseph Whalen. How you doing today, Joe?
I'm doing great, Sam. How are you doing?
Figured we keep it, not so formal for the show. Right. I'm doing pretty good. Today's episode is going to be an update to episode 16. If you guys check that out, we talked about Microsoft in that episode. And it's been about a year since that big deal with Microsoft, Activision, Blizzard. That's all still been going on for a year. So we're going to give you a little bit of an update on that, as well as the state of Microsoft and where we think their games are going in the future. So just off the top, have you heard anything big about this acquisition or potential acquisition since that episode 16?
Well, I know they've ran into some issues with U.S. regulatory and UK, right? But I think they got green lights in Europe, which I think is kind of ironic that the UK is fighting it, but the EU actually kind of gave them the green light on it.
Yes, when our global nations have to interact with our gaming companies, things can get pretty complicated. But just a quick recap before we take a break. On January the 18th, 2022, Microsoft announced they were acquiring Activision Blizzard in an all-cash transaction. I forgot about that part. Valued at $68.7 billion or $95 a share at the time. Like we said, however, in the year since that, there have been lots of changes, lots of roadblocks, and things have definitely not gone as planned for Microsoft. So today we're going to look at some of those recent developments for the games and the state of the deal and the rough release of one game in particular and what the future looks like for Xbox and their games. So before we take our break, just want to remind you, you can subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Amazon, Pandora. Anywhere you get your podcast, we will be there for you. Contact information, you can email us at comments@insightsintothings.com. Twitter, we are insights_things. Facebook, you can search us there as well. Instagram, Insights Into Things. And all these links can be found on our websites, insightsintothings.com. Anything else to add?
I think that's it.
All right, let's get right into it. We'll be right back. And we're back. Welcome back, everybody. Insights Into Tomorrow, number 19, talking Microsoft, talking Blizzard, talking Activision. So, as I gave the recap in the beginning, this deal happened about a year ago for around $69 billion. However, there was some recent news which caused us to want to record this episode. So after months of deliberating, the United Kingdom's Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA, which is like their version of the FTC, blocked Microsoft's pending acquisition of Activision Blizzard, primarily citing the potential monopolization of cloud gaming services if the deal went through. Now, we're deep in the Microsoft ecosystem, I'd say. I play Xbox all the time. You've been a Microsoft fan for a lot of your life, I think.
Sure.
Do you think cloud gaming when you think Microsoft?
Actually, no, I don't. As a matter of fact, recently I had canceled my Game Pass subscription.
Oh, really?
I hadn't been using it. There wasn't any games. All the games that were coming out on Game Pass were uninteresting. There wasn't anything that I liked, and I wasn't playing anything on there because I had moved over to predominantly play, when I did console, I moved over to the PlayStation. But most of my gaming's on the PC to begin with anyway, and I wasn't taking advantage of any of the Game Pass stuff on PC anymore. Like I played through Halo Infinite, and that was like the last big thing that I really did with Xbox, and I was playing Call of Duty and a couple of time killers is what I refer to them as, but there wasn't anything that really kept my interest on it, so I couldn't justify the cost.
Yeah, I'm partially responsible for your shift to Sony and PlayStation. I've definitely recommended a lot of those games to you. But personally, I use Game Pass all the time. I think it's still the best value in gaming. If you're, for the kind of person that I am when I play games, I like to try all different kinds of things. And I think for the price you're paying, you're getting a great variety, as well as all those things that are already included, and they're updating it regularly.
Well, and I don't doubt its value. I just doubt my use for it at the time.
Right.
And I've taken the same mentality with streaming video now. Like, if there's something that I want to watch, I'll subscribe to that service. I'll watch whatever it is, and then when it's between seasons, I'll get rid of it if there isn't anything else that really interests me. And there hasn't been any games that Microsoft has been coming out that has been interesting enough to me to keep it. Whereas, you have me on PlayStation doing Ragnarok, you have me doing Last of Us, Spider-Man. So I've been kind of embroiled in all those games now. So I wasn't touching the Xbox for anything other than physical games that I own, like Rock Band and stuff like that.
Yeah, you mentioned the lack of games on Xbox, and that's something we're going to hit on a little bit later on the show. But going back to the citing of cloud gaming as part of the reason why this deal was blocked in the United Kingdom, this is a quote from Martin Coleman, who chaired the panel that investigated the deal. He said, "Cloud gaming needs a free, competitive market to drive innovation and choice that is best achieved by allowing the current competitive dynamics in cloud gaming to continue to do their job." Now, where this argument comes from is because part of your Games Pass subscription is something called xCloud, which is Microsoft's version of cloud gaming, where you can, boot up you can stream games to your phone or to your TV without having to download them. And it is very convenient. I don't really use it because I don't have a problem with storage too much. But that's kind of the main thrust of it. And we'll get into it a little bit later, but the numbers were slightly inflated because they're assuming that everyone that uses Games Pass is also using that xCloud service, and that's just not the case. This is from the Gamer article we have linked in the show notes here. The CMA claims that if the acquisition goes through, it would only reinforce the Xbox maker's strong position in cloud gaming, and it could potentially hold control of 60 to 70% of the cloud gaming market. And that's sort of where we get those inflated numbers, right? 60 to 70% of the market. Obviously, that would be a monopoly, and sort of a monopoly. I guess 100% would be a monopoly, but that's a scary number, having one company control 60 or 70% of that market, especially since gaming in general is sort of shifting toward that cloud method of service, where you don't necessarily have to download your games. You can just stream them. You have the Xbox that you have, the one without the disk drive,
Right.
is primarily meant to have that service, so you don't have to download the games because it has a smaller storage capacity.
It's funny you mention that. I've never actually streamed a game to my console. All the games I've had, I've downloaded and played on the local machine itself. If they're talking streaming as their definition of cloud gaming, I don't know how popular that is, because there are technological limitations to that.
Yep.
There's only, yes, it's great that I can burn somebody else's computer resources and graphics to generate the stuff and stream it down to me. But when you're playing stuff that's competitive, online gaming, like first-person shooters, there's latency from the time that you push a button on your controller to the time it gets to the server and gets back to you. You can't overcome. That latency is a limitation of the speed of light. You can't overcome that. We have no way to overcome that right now. So unless they're putting data centers in right around the corner from my house that I'm streaming from, there's a technological problem from running it locally to running it over there. And if that's what they're calling cloud-based gaming, I think you're limited in what you can offer as far as that. You want to play Words with Friends or the puzzle games and stuff like that, I think you're okay. But when you want to get into, the die-hard competitive games where people are running cheats to take advantage of that lag time, I don't think that's the right recipe for it. And I think that's a lot of the reason why Google got out of the streaming gaming too.
Yeah, it's definitely the biggest barrier to entry, right? Not everybody has top of the line internet all around the country, especially when you're getting into less populated areas. In some parts of in this country alone, it's just not going to work, right? Because you've got satellite based internet or something like that.
Yeah.
So you're already limiting your market there. Now latency has always been a problem with multiplayer games, especially in fighting games, and they've kind of found workarounds with it with rollback netcode, where the game is trying to anticipate and guess what you're going to do before you do it, and that can significantly help with that latency. But when you're looking at a company like Microsoft, whose predominant AAA games are all not first person shooters, but they're all competitive shooters like Halo, Gears of War, even Sea of Thieves, which is definitely not competitive, but it is still a multiplayer online experience. Latency is going to be a problem in all those games. So is cloud gaming the direction you really want to push this in if you're relying on that multiplayer ecosystem pretty much at all times?
Well, and the other issue that you run into from a technological standpoint is when you're streaming games, you need a lot of bandwidth to stream the games. When you're playing on your local console to a server in the cloud, you're only sending telemetry at that point. So it's much less bandwidth requirements in order to handle that kind of data than if you're trying to stream the actual game back and forth. Yeah, you're upstreaming telemetry to it when you're streaming the game, but all that video is pre-processed, pre-rendered, and basically streamed down to you as if you're watching it at that point in time on a TV. So that takes a lot of bandwidth. And you've already got companies like Comcast and Verizon that are capping your bandwidth now because of the amount of usage you have. And as you move to a model where your model relies on enhancing the amount of bandwidth you use, you're going to start getting pushback from your ISPs. You're going to start getting data caps. You've already got home internet from T-Mobile and Verizon and AT&T over their cellular networks where you only get that high-speed 5G for a certain amount of that month. And when you hit a certain cap, it drops it down to slower speeds, and that's going to have an impact on this type of gaming.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about. Like, if this is the push we're gonna go for, it seems like Sony has its own version of Games Pass where they've got a ever-changing catalog of games coming in that you pay a flat fee per month, and then you can download these games and play them as they come to the service. It's just like what they have with Games Pass, and Ubisoft has one. A lot of these companies, they're doing that Netflix of gaming approach, combined with the cloud gaming aspect as well. So, if that's the way the industry is going, what is that going to look like with other companies, like you talk about the ISPs and things like that? Is everybody going to have to change if that's where gaming is going in the future? Because this is still, a multi-million-dollar, multi-billion-dollar industry that can throw its weight around if it needs to.
Well, and what's going to happen is the same thing that happened with streaming. You're going to have partnerships with the ISPs where the gaming companies are going to have to pay for premier access. Netflix, for instance. So Netflix actually has licensing arrangements with the various ISPs where Netflix puts essentially a caching proxy server inside their network. So when you request a movie for Netflix, you'll go up to Comcast. Comcast will hit the server that they're hosting, and if the movie's there, it'll stream from there. If it's not, it'll go out to Netflix then and get it, but then it caches it inside that network. So everyone else who requests that movie now gets it from the local. You're going to run into them doing the same type of thing where you're going to have exclusive partnerships with ISPs, which is going to cost the gaming companies money, and the gaming companies aren't going to absorb it. They're obviously going to pass it down to the customers, so you're going to see an increase in your monthly cost for that when the ISPs start getting fed up with it.
Yeah, we're already seeing increases in prices of Games Pass and things like that. Netflix too is notorious for raising their prices. All streaming services, it's just part of the I guess the business practice is how these things go. And especially you talked about how you'll cancel your service if you're not using it. Most people don't do that. I'm one of them. The companies count on you not canceling and just letting it lapse every month so they can keep getting that money.
Well, and they deliberately make it difficult to cancel. You can't say, "Oh, if I don't renew this, I don't want it to auto renew." You can't stop auto renews on these. And when you go to cancel them, you got to jump through, 4 or 5 flaming hoops to go through to cancel these because they're counting on people not to go through that hassle.
Yeah, exactly. Getting back to the Microsoft Activision deal, though, this blockage in the UK is a huge blow for Microsoft, and the acquisition continues to face roadblocks from various international regulators. The FTC also is suing to block the deal in the US, citing concerns over Microsoft's habit of acquiring game studios as part of the Microsoft gaming brand. So that the FTC is not necessarily going with the cloud gaming angle. They're more worried about Microsoft buying up all these studios and sort of putting them under the Microsoft umbrella and having too much influence on them. But historically, Microsoft hasn't really done that. They will buy a studio and acquire it, but only so they can have their games on Games Pass. They don't necessarily have direct influence on the creative side of things, which you could see as better or worse, as we'll talk about in our second segment. But yeah, Microsoft has generally had a hands-off approach to a lot of these studios, aside from asking for that Games Pass Day 1 exclusive. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, and I think that's probably the most dangerous aspect of this entire thing for Microsoft, because it signals a level of scrutiny that they've not been under before. Because the acquisition of development studios for gaming isn't just restricted to gaming for Microsoft. They've done this across the board for all the properties they're offering. Their antivirus software was acquired. Their voice messaging service was acquired. Their team service was acquired. And it was all acquired and rebranded. So if they're going to get government regulation looking into their acquisition of various development companies for gaming, what would stop it at gaming? When they start acquiring things that become competitive in different aspects, because Lord knows Microsoft has already had issues with monopoly complaints and stuff like that. But this is a practice they do across the board, not just gaming. So if they're getting scrutiny for gaming now, that's going to open up the board for everything against them moving forward.
Yeah, I think ultimately what a lot of this comes back to is it pro-consumer or anti-consumer? And I think when you even enter the monopoly word into the conversation, I think immediately it's going to turn a lot of people off. We don't want, myself included, we don't want one company owning everything, because then it stifles creativity, it stifles innovation, and especially when it comes to gaming, when one company is buying up all these studios, it can, and if those studios are poorly managed by the overhead company, it can negatively impact the kind of games we're getting, not to mention all the people that work for those studios. We haven't had a similar issue with Sony. Sony acquiring Insomniac, Guerrilla Games. They've been doing the same thing, but their games are very successful because Sony is much more hands-on with how they're running these studios. They have a very clear vision of what they want a Sony-branded game to be, and Microsoft hasn't really done that. And unfortunately, Sony is kind of winning this arms race of studio acquisitions because of their more hands-on approach.
Well, and Microsoft traditionally has had that issue across the board on all their properties, where the only property that they're really being successful at managing is their Azure system, their cloud server providers. Everything else, they don't seem to know what they want to do. Like, it still puzzles a lot of people that Microsoft is even involved in gaming. Microsoft dipped their toe in the hardware, the computer hardware business back with the Surface Pro series line launch, and all that did was really anger all their OEMs because it's cutting into their business. So Microsoft seems to have this, I want to do everything, but I don't necessarily want to do everything good. And the lack of quality seems to show quite frequently in some of their offerings.
Yeah. So despite the UK and US kind of combating the deal, the EU, European Union, has approved the deal despite those countries' hesitations. And again, like I mentioned before, EU officials claim that the estimation of Xbox cloud gaming dominance is being overstated, with all Xbox Games Pass users being counted as cloud gaming users, despite that not being the primary purpose of the service. So if the deal goes through, would Xbox truly hold a monopoly? If they are able to acquire Activision, Blizzard, and King. I don't know. I'd have to rewatch episode 16. It was a long time ago. But King is the mobile brand and side of that thing. And mobile games make a ton of money. So if, King makes Candy Crush and all those kind of games, if Microsoft were to hold that, would they have a monopoly in the market? And what does this mean for other gaming companies like Sony and Nintendo?
Well, and that's the thing. I don't think it would be a monopoly from the get-go. And I think in a market as volatile as the gaming market is and as fickle as the gaming market is, the market will regulate itself for the most part. If it becomes monopolistic, then you can step in and regulate it and break it up. You're not going to stop consolidation in the gaming market. You're just not, because you've got 3 platforms, really, 2 platforms. I don't really count Nintendo as a competitive platform at this point.
I don't know. They got that new Zelda game making a lot of money.
And that's probably the last good game they're going to come out with on the Switch.
With the Switch, yeah. 7-year-old outdated hardware.
Yeah. But that's their shtick, really. But you don't have platforms out there that you can release this stuff on. So as a result, you're going to have consolidation. Remember way back when Sega decided that they were getting out of the console business and they had all their exclusives, and they basically, all the sharks that were circling around, Microsoft and Sony and everyone, swooped in to get these exclusives. Well, how many of those exclusives are exclusives that are exclusive moneymakers now? Sonic the Hedgehog. Aside from a really, I don't know, questionable choice on movies, since when has Sonic the Hedgehog been something that's been significant?
Sonic Frontiers. That was like last year.
Yeah.
I don't think it's exclusive, though. Is it? I don't know. I have to look.
I don't think it is. But when that happened, everyone thought that you were going to have monopolies come out of that. And you're not. People are going to buy the game that's quality. And if you don't put out a quality game, it doesn't matter how many game studios you own. If it's not quality, they're not going to use it. And Microsoft has run into this numerous times. You know how many people have moved off of Microsoft Office because of how terrible it's become?
Yeah.
And they don't want to pay for the subscription for a service that they've never paid. Like, just questionable business practices is what turns people off. And Microsoft has kind of demonstrated, they've been the poster boy of how not to be monopolistic at this point in time based on quality.
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to that issue of quality, which is exactly what we're going to cover in our next segment. After the break, we'll take a look at the launch of Redfall and other Xbox games exclusives and how they impact Xbox's place in the gaming landscape, and of course, that ever important question of quality. Right after the break, we'll be right back.
For over 7 years, the Second Sith Empire has been the premier community guild in the online game Star Wars: The Old Republic. With hundreds of friendly and helpful active members, a weekly schedule of nightly events, annual guild meet and greets, and an active community both on the web and on Discord. The Second Sith Empire is more than your typical gaming group. We're family. Join us on the Starforge server for nightly events such as operations, flashpoints, world boss hunts, Star Wars trivia, guild lottery, and much more. Visit us on the web today at www.thesecondsithempire.com.
Welcome back, everyone, to episode 19 of Insights into Tomorrow, where we are talking the Microsoft acquisition of Blizzard and Activision and King. Acquisition and Activision are really hard to say in the same sentence.
That is a tongue twister.
My name is Sam Whalen, and of course we've got Joseph Whalen on the other side, on the ones and twos. But we just talked about the deal itself. Now we're going to get more into the issue of quality and what that means for Xbox going forward. So the big news story in the past couple weeks, if you follow any kind of gaming news, is the release of Redfall. This comes from publisher Bethesda and developer Arcane Studios. You might know Arcane from games like Prey and Dishonored. All great games. Redfall was released on May the 2nd to disastrous critical and audience reviews. This was kind of a big shock. Well, for a while it was a big shock. There was some IGN footage that had come out before the game came out that people ragged on the reviewer that was playing it because they weren't. It looked like they were bad at games. Kind of boil it down. But when the game came out, people realized that that's just the game. The game is not easy to play, and it's really poorly optimized, and it's a big letdown from a studio like Arcane that is known for their immersive sims like Prey and Dishonored. I've played the game myself. I've played Redfall. It's real bad. But it did come out to Games Pass, so I had the opportunity to play it as part of that subscription. Have you seen any footage or reviews or articles about Redfall?
I've seen some gameplay footage of it. I haven't played it myself, obviously, because I don't have my Game Pass subscription. And I've read a couple of reviews. In fact, in preparation for the show today, I was doing some research on it. And you're right, the reviews pretty much across the board are pretty consistent. And when you start getting 4 or 5 people that are saying the same exact thing that's wrong with the game, chances are that's probably what's wrong with the game.
Yeah.
But I'll be honest with you, I'm not shocked given the hype around this and what the great hope for this was supposed to be. The last 4 or 5 years of games like that have kind of fallen flat. You had Halo Infinite had the same problems. You had Cyberpunk had the same type of problem. Like, you have games that the market is demanding that they come out. You have pressures on development houses that are forcing you to release games before they're ready. And I honestly think that part of the problem with this is largely to do with the cloud infrastructure, because the idea, the philosophy right now is, oh, well, we can kick that out and patch it next week.
Yeah.
We're fine. We're good. Where before, when you put it out on a disk and you didn't have all the cloud infrastructure in place, it had to work. You didn't have the opportunity to put 5 patches out. We just saw it happen with the new Star Wars game that
Jedi
came
Survivor.
out. The first patch that came out was literally 3 times the size of the original game. So It doesn't shock me. I think the problem we have is the market drivers that are forcing these out rely too heavily on the fact that they can be patched, but they neglect to take into effect the negative press that your property is going to get in the process.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Phil Spencer, who's sort of the public face of Xbox, he's not the, I don't think he's a CEO, but he's like the guy when you think Xbox. He's been doing the rounds. He's been taking the hits for Redfall. But one of the things he talked about was this concept of when to delay a game. And he says it's not always purely based on hitting that economic goal. Sometimes it is for creative reasons. And a lot of what he talked about was ultimately what they say is what it comes down to is if the studio is not meeting their creative goals, then that's when there's a serious issue. And he not so subtly suggested that might have been part of the problem with Redfall is that the folks at Arcane were not necessarily making the game they wanted to make, but this game was hyped up a lot and it had to come out, and they already delayed it, and it didn't really seem to make that much of a difference. You talk about Jedi Survivor had the same thing. That game got delayed. But still came out with a litany of technical issues, a litany of problems, and a day one patch that was like 100 gigs. So, it's the past 3 months have seen multiple releases that are almost fully broken at launch, especially on PC. I mean, you play a lot on PC.
Yeah.
PC ports are notoriously not as well optimized as a console. But it really starts to raise the question of, exactly what you said, this tarnishing of the brand of, it's almost become standard when a AAA game releases to give it 3 to 4 months to have it actually be functional, especially if it's a multiplayer game. And it's at what point did this just become okay? I'm still the guy, I'm definitely part of the problem. I will buy a game day one if I want it. But yeah, a lot of these games are coming out and they're just not finished. And when a game will take 4 to 5 years to make, do we give it 6 to 7 years at that point? Is that too long? Is it an issue of crunch in development where developers are getting high pressure to put these games out, so they're slipping up and there's issues there? Is it a marketing problem? Are we showing these games too early? We put out a CGI trailer 3 years before the game comes out, and people every year are asking at Summer Games Fest and things like that, where's Redfall? Where's whatever? That by the time the game comes out, it's not at all what people thought it was going to be, which is kind of what happened with Redfall. Nobody really knew what it was because it was a lot of cool CGI trailers. You knew it was a shooter. You knew it was Arcane, so you can imagine you're going to have some immersive sim elements, probably some supernatural or magic elements. But then the game gets closer to release, and you have these people doing previews, and they describe it as Far Cry or Destiny, and everybody's scratching their heads of what? That's not what Arcane has ever been known for. They're known for single-player immersive experiences, and Redfall comes out, and it's like a Far Cry Borderlands type game, and it doesn't even really nail that because those kind of games don't really perform as well as they used to. And in the 2010s, that was sort of the formula. Massive open world, play how you want. But Redfall doesn't really do that well either, unfortunately. And, I don't want to sit here and just bash the game, because I do like Arcane. I'm a big Prey fan. I love Dishonored. Redfall just wasn't hitting the mark. It's got a current score on Metacritic, the Xbox version, a 56 on Metacritic, 3.5 user score, with critics citing extremely poor performance, uninteresting mechanics, and it overall just felt rushed. And like I said, play the game myself, that is very true. From the moment you boot it up, there aren't cutscenes. It's just still images with audio over it. And I'm like, what are we? I don't know, it blows my mind. There's a lot of little issues. There's a lot of texture pop in. You can go watch the Digital Foundry video on YouTube. They did a great breakdown of it, of the nitty gritty technical issues. And it's how does a game like this come out in 2023? It blows my mind.
Well, and a lot of people want to rush to judge Microsoft on this for having a game come out that doesn't meet their standards. And like you had said in the previous segment, Microsoft has been largely hands-off on this project and most of their development studios. So I think the problem that you run into is Microsoft is involved from a finance standpoint and from a make sure it gets out the door on time standpoint. But from the creative side of things, I think Microsoft is largely hands-off on a lot of this stuff. And I think that's probably the problem, is that if you're coming out with an exclusive on Microsoft's platform, Microsoft needs to be there. It needs to be part of that process to make sure that it meets their standards. And it makes me wonder, maybe it does meet their standards. Maybe Microsoft's standards are just that low.
Yeah.
Because what this is a reflection of so many other things that Microsoft has released that is subpar and is one of those kick it out the door, we'll patch it later type things.
Wow.
So it very well might meet their standards is the problem.
Yeah, and it's tough because when you own a studio and you have the ability to make sure that all the problems that modern day releases have don't happen, but you still do, right? Like we talk about Cyberpunk and how disastrous that was. That wasn't owned by anybody. That was CD Projekt Red. That was their game published on all platforms or released on all platforms, and it had all those issues. You look at a Sony game, you look at Ragnarok, you look at Horizon Forbidden West, you look at Spider-Man 2 whenever that comes out, or Spider-Man 1 even. There is a pedigree to a Sony game. When you boot it up, you know that it's probably going to be awesome, at the very least, or, you know, not have a lot of these problems that a lot of modern day games are facing. There aren't that many technical glitches. It runs well. It tells a good story. And, you know, Sony's focusing on single player games while Microsoft is more on the multiplayer side of things. But there still has to be that pedigree when you are a big studio like, or not a studio, sorry, a big publisher like Microsoft or a big company like Sony. You've got to have a quality control level that sets the standard for your brand. I mean, it's just, you know, I don't know how else to describe it.
Well, and I'll be honest with you, I have been out of the Sony ecosystem for quite some time until you kind of dragged me back into it kicking and screaming when I was finally able to get hands on a PS5. And the gaming experience, first of all, the user interface on the PS5s is completely different than the Xbox. I found the PS5 to be much more refined, much more, well, it was difficult. There was a learning curve for me. Whereas the interface on the Xbox is juvenile almost. It's cluttered.
It's awful.
It is. It's hard to navigate. But the gaming experience itself, you know, when I fired up the last two games that you had me play, you know, the
Last of Us?
Last of Us and
Ragnarok?
God of War.
Yeah.
When I fired those up, it wasn't a gaming experience. It was a movie experience from day one. From the time you turned it on, the menus, everything. It was an interactive movie. You felt like you were part of it. The cutscenes, the dialogue, everything, the acting, the story. It was an interactive movie that you were part of. Maybe that's because it was focused for single player.
Right.
I don't get that. Like, I didn't get that when I played, you know, the sequel to Red Dead. I didn't get that from Red Dead either. But the Sony experience itself, the attention to detail, and the level of quality. Now, granted, Spider-Man had some quality issues in it.
No, you think so?
Yeah, there's a few things in there that were an issue. But for the most part, everything was cinematic in the experience that I got to play. And it made me really enjoy the experience. And when I play stuff on Xbox, it's literally just to kill time. It's not to enjoy myself, to immerse myself, or anything. So they're two very different types of gaming styles and platforms. And they're managed very differently. That quality comes across, and it's just blatantly obvious in just starting the game up.
Yep.
You know, and that's where the biggest contrast, I think, is to me.
Yeah, and you know, Redfall comes out at the time when Microsoft has been sorely lacking in those first-party AAA titles, which is exactly what you talk about. Off the top of your head, you can name 3 or 4 Sony games that you've played that hit a chord with you.
Yeah.
And Microsoft just doesn't have that, and they haven't for a very long time.
Well, and I'll tell you, I'm a huge, huge Halo fan.
Yep.
Okay. Not only have I loved every one of the games that came out, well, I've played every one of the games that came out.
Halo Wars 2?
I've read all the novels. I'm up to date. I'm in the middle of reading the latest novel.
We're
now.
both huge Halo fans.
Love it, love it, love it. Halo Infinite just did not resonate with me. Did not hit with me. It seemed. It's ironic that the environment that you're in was so broken, because it felt like the storyline and the character development and everything else was equally broken.
Yep.
Like you jump into this and you're completely disjointed. You have no idea what's going on. it was buggy. There was a number of glitches that crept up through the thing that prevented me from progressing until a patch came out. But it just didn't have that refined feel. And the fact that the terrain that you're on is literally a shattered world only reinforced. And to me, it was almost like, oh, well, they just didn't finish it. They decided to make it part of the storyline.
Yeah, the ring is unfinished that you're on.
Right.
Yeah.
And, like, it literally felt like they just didn't feel like finishing the game. And so much the game was missing when it came out. I played through it. I did all the side missions, and I haven't gone back to it in months, probably a year at this point. And there's no reason for me to.
Right. Yeah. So Halo Infinite came out in 2021. Personally, I really enjoyed the campaign at launch. But, you know, Halo is always kind of a weird story to follow if you go play all the games. Like, the story is not always the forefront. It's always the gameplay. And the gameplay in Infinite was good, but a lot of where the issues come in is with the multiplayer of Infinite. It had little to no multiplayer support post-launch, and you know, it took forever to get the content updates going for that service. It took forever for that to start rolling out, and it ended up leading to Microsoft cleaning house at 343 months after the release, just because of how big of a failure it was. I still play Halo multiplayer every once in a while. I don't know why. I just really, it's still Halo at the end of the day, you know, and I still enjoy that. But it had so much potential, and everybody at the time was saying, Microsoft can't mess this up. And they kind of did. Like, the multiplayer at launch, everybody was on